The 2:47 a.m. routine. My name is Hiroko, and I work as a live-in helper for Yamada-san, an 83-year-old gentleman whose children live too far away to care for him daily. It's honest work, and the pay covers my university expenses while I study nursing part-time. The arrangement suits us both. He gets the company he needs, and I have a roof over my head in Tokyo's expensive housing market. Yamada-san's apartment in Setagaya Ward was reasonably priced when his late wife found it 15 years ago. It's a modest two-bedroom unit on the fourth floor of a 7-story building, with thin walls typical of older Japanese construction. The building manager, Sato-san, is helpful, but often mentions how difficult it's become to keep all units occupied. Young people today are too picky, he says, though I suspect there are other reasons for the frequent vacancies. When I first moved in during the spring of 2023, everything seemed normal. Yamada-san and I established our routine quickly. I help him with meals, light cleaning, and medication reminders. He enjoys our evening conversations over tea, sharing stories from his 40 years as a department store manager. His mind remains sharp, and his gentle nature makes the work pleasant rather than burdensome. The disturbances began my second week there. Every night, at exactly 2:47 a.m., I'm awakened by sounds from the apartment directly above us. It starts with a chair scraping against the floor, a slow, deliberate drag across what must be a wooden or tile surface. The sound is distinctive, heavy, like someone moving furniture with great effort or intention. After the scraping comes a pause of perhaps 30 seconds. Then footsteps begin measured, unhurried steps moving from what would be the main room toward the balcony. I can track the path perfectly because our apartment shares the same layout as the unit above. The footsteps always follow the identical route, from the center of the main room, past what would be the kitchen area, toward the sliding glass door that leads to the balcony. Then comes silence. Complete, absolute silence that lasts exactly until 3:15 a.m., when I hear the sliding door close with a soft thud. At first, I assumed we simply had an insomniac neighbor with unusual habits. Tokyo apartment living means accepting the sounds of others' lives through thin walls and floors. But the precision troubled me every night, the exact same time, the identical sequence of sounds, lasting precisely 28 minutes. During my third week, I mentioned it to Yamada-san during our morning tea. His reaction surprised me. His face grew pale, and he set down his cup with trembling hands. "You hear it too?" he whispered. "Too?" I asked. "Yamada-san, have you been hearing the same sounds?" He nodded slowly. "For months now, since last autumn. But I thought perhaps my hearing was playing tricks. Old men sometimes imagine things." I assured him his hearing was fine. "Should we speak to the building manager? Perhaps there's a noise ordinance issue." Yamada-san's expression grew troubled. "Hiroko-chan, I must tell you something. The apartment above us, it's been empty since September." My tea grew cold as he explained. The previous tenant, a salaryman named Matsui-san, had lived alone in Unit 508 for 3 years. He worked long hours at a trading company, was quiet, kept to himself. In September, he'd lost his job due to company downsizing. A week later, the building manager found his body on the balcony. "Suicide?" I asked quietly. Yamada-san nodded. The police investigation concluded he jumped sometime around 3 a.m. Since then, the apartment has remained vacant. Sato-san says he's had trouble renting it. That evening, I paid closer attention to the sounds above. At 2:47 a.m. precisely, the chair scraped. But now, knowing the apartment was empty, the sound took on a different quality. It wasn't just furniture being moved, it was methodical, ritualistic, like a ceremony being performed. The footsteps followed, and I found myself counting them. 23 steps from the main room to the balcony door. I knew this because I'd walked the same path in our apartment below. Our units were mirror images, sharing identical floor plans. As the footsteps reached What would be the balcony door? I crept to our own sliding glass entrance and peered upward. The building's balconies were stacked vertically, each one directly above the next. Unit 508's balcony was clearly visible from our position. At exactly 3 a.m., I saw him. A man in a dark business suit stood at the railing of the balcony above. His posture was rigid, formal, like someone preparing to give a presentation or make an important announcement. He remained motionless for precisely 15 minutes, then turned and walked back inside. The sliding door closed with the familiar soft thud. I watched this routine for several nights, always from the same position on our balcony. The figure never varied his behavior, the same posture, the same duration, the same precise timing. But something else began to disturb me. Our balcony, directly below his, had started to feel different, colder. The plants Yamada, San's wife, had left there began wilting despite adequate water and sunlight. During my nursing classes, I'd learned about psychological phenomena, how suggestion and fear can create false perceptions. But this felt entirely real. The temperature drop on our balcony was measurable. I used a thermometer to confirm it was consistently 5 degrees cooler than the interior of our apartment, even during warm spring weather. More troubling was Yamada, San's behavior. He'd begun waking at 2:47 a.m. as well, but instead of staying in bed, he would sleepwalk to our balcony. I'd find him standing at the railing in his pajamas, in the exact same posture as the figure above, rigid, formal, staring out into the night. When I gently guided him back to bed, he had no memory of leaving his room. But in the morning, he would mention strange dreams about his old job, about presentations he needed to give, about standing in front of important meetings where he couldn't remember his lines. By May, I realized the situation required intervention beyond my capabilities. I contacted my grandmother in Hiroshima, who has always been sensitive to spiritual matters. She listened carefully to my description, asking specific questions about timing, temperature, and Yamada, San's sleepwalking behavior. The deceased is completing his final ritual, she explained, but his death energy is contaminating the apartment below through the balcony connection. Your employer's spirit is vulnerable because of his age and grief over his wife's death. She recommended I contact a Buddhist monk she knew in Tokyo, someone who specialized in apartment purification for modern urban spiritual problems. This cannot be banished completely, she warned, but it can be contained so it doesn't spread further. The monk, Tanaka-san, visited our apartment the following week. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 40, with practical experience in dealing with jikobuken properties and spiritual contamination in modern buildings. After examining both our apartment and consulting with the building manager about Unit 508's history, he confirmed my grandmother's assessment. The deceased's routine has become spiritually embedded in the building's structure. The identical layout creates a spiritual mirror. What happens above reflects below. Tanaka-san performed purification rituals throughout our apartment, paying special attention to the balcony area. He placed protective omamori at our sliding door and taught me how to maintain spiritual barriers that would prevent the contamination from affecting Yamada-san's sleep. This will contain the influence, he explained, but you must understand, the deceased will continue his routine. That cannot be changed. What we can do is protect your household from being drawn into it. The protective measures worked, mostly. Yamada-san stopped sleepwalking, and the temperature on our balcony returned to normal. But every night at 2:47 a.m., I still hear the chair scraping above, the measured footsteps, the sliding door opening. And I still see him, the figure in the business suit, maintaining his vigil on the balcony above ours. But now I understand what I'm witnessing. It's not a haunting in the traditional sense. It's a routine that has transcended death, a final professional obligation that continues to be fulfilled with the same precision he once brought to his corporate responsibilities. Sato-san eventually told me more about Matsui, San's final days. He'd been preparing for job interviews, practicing presentations late into the night. The night he died, neighbors reported seeing lights in his apartment until nearly 3 a.m. He'd been rehearsing, preparing, maintaining the professional standards that had defined his adult life. Even in death, he continues to prepare for a meeting that will never come, a presentation that will never be given, a professional obligation that extends beyond the boundaries of mortality. The apartment above remains empty. Sato-san has stopped trying to rent it, quietly accepting that some properties become permanently marked by their histories. The 3-year disclosure period for Jikobuken properties has passed, but word travels in close-knit Tokyo neighborhoods. Everyone in the building knows about Unit 508. I continue working for Yamada-san, and our routine has adapted around the nightly disturbances. We've learned to live with the supernatural schedule above us, protecting ourselves while respecting the boundaries of what cannot be changed. But sometimes, during the day when sunlight fills our apartment, I catch myself checking my watch at 2:47 p.m., waiting for sounds that only come after midnight. The routine has become part of my life too, a reminder that some obligations transcend the normal boundaries of existence. The most disturbing part isn't the supernatural activity itself, it's how easily we've all adapted to it. Yamada-san, myself, even Sato-san, have accepted that certain apartments maintain their own schedules, their own purposes, regardless of whether anyone living occupies them. That acceptance, I've come to understand, is perhaps the most haunting aspect of modern urban life. We coexist with the remnants of other people's unfinished business, their unresolved obligations, their routines that continue long after they themselves have departed. Every night at 2:47 a.m., I listen to the sounds above and remember that some responsibilities are so deeply embedded in our daily lives that even death cannot release us from them. And somewhere in that realization, I find both comfort and deep, lasting unease about what obligations might survive my own eventual departure from this world. Adjacent Hearts. My name is Kenji, and I'm a third-year literature student at Waseda University. When I found the apartment in Nakano Ward for 30,000 yen per month, in half the typical rate for the area, I thought I'd discovered the perfect solution to Tokyo's crushing rental market. My part-time job at a convenience store barely covers living expenses, and my parents in Sendai can only send limited support since my father's factory reduced his hours. The apartment is small but adequate. A 6-tatami main room, tiny kitchen, and separate bathroom. The building itself is older, constructed in the 1980s, with the thin walls typical of that era's rapid construction. My unit, 203, shares its eastern wall with apartment 204. During my initial viewing, the real estate agent, Hayashi-san, mentioned that the neighboring unit was currently vacant, which meant extra quiet for studying. What he didn't mention, what I discovered only after signing the lease, was why the rent was so reasonable. For the first 2 weeks, everything seemed normal. I established my routine. Morning classes, afternoon shifts at the store, evening study sessions. The building was quiet, mostly occupied by other students and young office workers. My neighbor's absence meant I could study late into the night without disturbing anyone. Then I began noticing the heartbeat. It started subtly, during my late-night study sessions, when the building was completely silent. A rhythmic thumping through the eastern wall, not loud, but persistent and unmistakably organic. The rhythm was too slow for machinery, too regular for random noise. It sounded exactly like a human heartbeat, heard through a stethoscope, magnified and transmitted through the wall's structure. At first, I assumed my neighbor had returned without my noticing. The heartbeat suggested someone sleeping against the shared wall, their pulse somehow conducting through the building's framework. It seemed medically unlikely, but not impossible. I'd read about sound transmission in older apartment buildings. But after several nights of the same phenomenon, I began paying closer attention to the adjacent unit. No lights appeared in the windows. No sounds of movement, television, or daily activities. The mailbox for apartment 204 remained stuffed with undelivered mail and advertisements. The apartment was definitely vacant. Yet every night, usually beginning around 11 p.m. and continuing until dawn, the heartbeat persisted through our shared wall. I mentioned it to my girlfriend Yuki during one of her weekend visits. She's studying psychology and approaches problems with scientific skepticism. Sound transmission can be strange in old buildings, she suggested. Maybe it's plumbing or vibrations from the building's structure settling at night. To test her theory, we listened together during one of her overnight stays. The heartbeat began at its usual time, clearly audible from the eastern wall. Yuki pressed her ear against the surface, frowning with concentration. It's definitely rhythmic, she admitted, but the pattern isn't consistent with mechanical sources. The tempo varies slightly, like a living heartbeat would. She suggested we investigate further. The next morning, I visited the building manager, Ito-san, an elderly man who'd overseen the property for nearly 20 years. His office was cluttered with maintenance records and tenant files, and he greeted me with the weary patience of someone accustomed to student complaints. "The heartbeat sounds?" he repeated when I described the phenomenon. His expression grew troubled. "You can hear it through the wall?" "Every night," I confirmed. "Is there some mechanical issue with the adjacent unit? Heating? Plumbing? Anything that might create rhythmic sounds?" Ito-san was quiet for a long moment, studying my file. "Apartment 204 has been vacant since last spring. There's no active utilities, no mechanical systems running." He paused, then asked carefully, "Have you experienced any other disturbances? Sounds, temperature changes, anything unusual?" I mentioned the slight cold spots I'd noticed along the eastern wall, areas where the temperature seemed consistently lower than the rest of the apartment. Ito-san's expression grew more serious. "I think you should know about the previous tenant," he said quietly. Apartment 204 had been occupied by Suzuki-san, a 26-year-old single mother who worked as a nurse at a nearby clinic. She'd lived there for 2 years with her infant daughter, Akane-chan. Neighbors described her as quiet, hardworking, devoted to her child despite the challenges of single parenthood. Last April, during a particularly stressful period when Akane-chan was suffering from chronic ear infections, Suzuki-san had suffered a massive cardiac arrest in the middle of the night. The baby's crying had alerted neighbors, but by the time paramedics arrived, Suzuki-san was beyond help. The infant survived, eventually placed with relatives in Osaka. "The apartment has been difficult to rent since then," Ito-san admitted. "Some tenants report disturbances, sounds, temperature changes, feelings of unease." He explained the legal situation as a jikobuken property where an unnatural death occurred. Apartment 204 carried a disclosure requirement for 3 years. Most potential tenants chose other options once they learned the history. "But your apartment shouldn't be affected," he insisted. "The events occurred next door, not in your unit." That evening, armed with this knowledge, I listened to the heartbeat with new understanding. The rhythm seemed more urgent now, more desperate. Instead of the steady pulse of peaceful sleep, it sounded like the rapid, stressed heartbeat of someone in distress or someone trying to reach something just beyond their grasp. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon intensified. The heartbeat began earlier each night, sometimes starting as early as 9 p.m. The sound grew stronger, more pronounced, as if the source was moving closer to the shared wall. During my study sessions, I found myself unconsciously synchronizing my breathing to its rhythm, then catching myself and feeling disturbed by the involuntary connection. More troubling were the temperature changes. The cold spots along the eastern wall became more pronounced, extending further into my apartment. I began wearing sweaters during evening study sessions, even during the warm, late spring weather. Yuki suggested I consult with someone knowledgeable about supernatural phenomena. Her grandmother in Kyoto had always been sensitive to spiritual matters and might offer insight into what I was experiencing. When I called Yuki's grandmother and described the situation, her response was immediate and concerned. "A mother who died while her child was in distress," she said. "Her maternal heart continues beating, trying to reach the baby who needed her." She explained that sudden death during intense emotional states could create spiritual residue, especially when maternal instincts were involved. The mother's heart knows only that her child was crying and needed comfort. Death didn't release that obligation, it intensified it. She recommended I contact a Buddhist monk experienced with apartment purifications, someone who could assess whether the spiritual activity was contained to the adjacent unit or bleeding into mine through the shared wall. I found Nakamura-san through recommendations from a local temple. He was a practical man in his 50s who specialized in modern urban spiritual problems. When he visited my apartment, he spent considerable time examining the eastern wall, particularly the areas where I'd noticed temperature changes. The spiritual energy is definitely originating from the adjacent unit, he confirmed, but shared walls in older buildings can conduct more than just sound. Emotional energy, spiritual residue, these things can seep through structural connections. He performed purification rituals throughout my apartment, paying special attention to the shared wall area. He also placed protective omamori at strategic points and taught me simple daily practices to maintain spiritual barriers. "The mother's heart will continue beating," he explained. "That cannot be changed. Her maternal drive is too strong, and the spiritual attachment to this location too deep. But we can protect you from being drawn into her distress." The protective measures helped significantly. The temperature in my apartment normalized, and the heartbeat, while still audible, no longer seemed to synchronize with my own pulse. I could study in peace, without feeling the involuntary connection to the desperate rhythm next door. But sometimes, late at night when the building is completely silent, I still hear it clearly, the steady, urgent heartbeat of a mother whose protective instincts transcend death. And occasionally, very faintly, I hear what sounds like an infant crying, though I know no babies live in our building. Ito-san eventually told me more details about that night last April. Neighbors reported that Akane-chan had been crying for hours before Suzuki-san's collapse. The ear infection was severe, and the baby was inconsolable despite all her mother's efforts to provide comfort. When the cardiac arrest struck, Suzuki-san was found in the baby's room, having apparently been trying to reach her crying child when her heart failed. The neighbors said the crying stopped immediately after the paramedics arrived, Ito-san mentioned, as if Akane-chan knew something had changed. I continue living in apartment 203, and my studies progress well. The reduced rent allows me to focus on literature instead of working excessive hours to afford housing. But I've developed habits I never expected. I play soft music during evening study sessions to mask the heartbeat, and I avoid placing my desk directly against the eastern wall. Most disturbing is my growing sensitivity to the rhythm itself. After months of nightly exposure, I've learned to distinguish subtle variations in the heartbeat's tempo. Sometimes it's rapid and anxious, as if responding to distress. Other times it's slower, almost peaceful, like a mother's heart during quiet moments with her child. The variations seem to correspond with sounds from the building, crying children in other units, babies being comforted by their parents, the normal domestic sounds of family life. It's as if Suzuki-san's heart is still responding to the needs of children, even though her own daughter is now safe with relatives, hundreds of kilometers away. Yuki visits less frequently now. She finds the apartment disturbing, though she struggles to articulate exactly why. "There's something sad about this place," she says. "Not frightening, just heartbreaking." I understand what she means. The supernatural presence next door isn't malevolent. It's desperate maternal love that continues beyond the boundaries of life and death. But there's something profoundly unsettling about living adjacent to such raw, unresolved emotion. Sometimes I wonder about Akane-chan, now being raised by her aunt in Osaka. Does she remember her mother's heartbeat from those months in the womb and early infancy? Does she ever feel a phantom comfort, a sense of being watched over by love that refuses to be extinguished by death? The lease on my apartment runs until next spring, and I'll probably renew it. The rent is too good to abandon, and I've learned to coexist with the heartbeat next door. But I've also developed a new understanding of how thoroughly love can permeate the places where we live. Every night, as I fall asleep to the steady rhythm through the eastern wall, I'm reminded that some bonds between parent and child are so fundamental that not even death can silence them. Suzuki, San's heart continues its vigilant beat, maintaining a mother's watch over a child who no longer needs protection, in a room that no longer echoes with infant cries. And somehow, in the small hours of the night, when the building is completely still, that endless maternal heartbeat has become a strange comfort, a reminder that love, once awakened, never truly ends, even when its object has moved beyond reach. The Replacement Daughter. My name is Michiko, and I made the mistake of believing that luck had finally turned in my favor. After 18 months of struggling to afford decent housing for my 6-year-old daughter Yui and myself, I found an apartment in Adachi Ward for 45,000 yen per month, nearly 30% below market rate for a 2-bedroom unit. The real estate agent, Kimura-san, explained that the building's owner was eager to maintain occupancy and offered competitive pricing for reliable tenants. As a single mother working night shifts at a packaging plant, reliable tenants like me are supposed to be grateful for any opportunity. My ex-husband provides minimal child support, and my parents in Niigata can barely manage their own expenses since my father's fishing business declined. The affordable apartment seemed like exactly what we needed to stabilize our lives. The unit itself was pleasant: 2 small bedrooms, a functional kitchen, and a balcony facing east toward a small park. Yui loved having her own room for the first time, and I appreciated the building's quiet atmosphere. Most residents were young families or elderly couples, creating a safe environment for a child being raised by a working mother. During our first week, I established our routine around my work schedule. I leave for the plant at 11 p.m. and return at 7 a.m., while my neighbor, Sato-san, watches Yui overnight for a reasonable fee. She's a retired teacher who lives 2 floors up and has grandchildren of her own. The arrangement allows me to work full-time while ensuring Yui is properly supervised. Everything seemed perfect until Yui began talking about the other mama. It started during my second week of night shifts. When I returned home one morning, Yui greeted me with unusual excitement. "Mama, the other mama visited last night," she announced over breakfast. She came through the balcony door and told me stories about her little girl. I assumed she was describing a dream or creating an imaginary friend to cope with my nighttime absence. Single children often develop elaborate fantasy companions, especially during periods of adjustment to new living situations. "What did the other mama look like?" I asked gently. "She has long black hair like yours, but she's very pale. She wears a white nightgown and she smells like flowers." Yui paused thoughtfully. "She says I remind her of her daughter, who went to sleep and won't wake up." The description was detailed but not particularly alarming. I made a mental note to ask Sato-san whether Yui had mentioned this imaginary friend during my shifts. When I spoke with Sato-san that evening before work, she seemed puzzled. "Yui slept peacefully all night," she reported. "No mention of dreams or visitors. But," she hesitated, "I did notice she seems drawn to the balcony. Several times I found her standing at the sliding door, looking out into the darkness." Over the following weeks, Yui's stories about the other mama became more frequent and detailed. According to my daughter, This mysterious woman visited regularly, always entering through the balcony door, despite my ensuring it remained locked each night. She would sit on Yui's bed, brush her hair, and tell stories about a little girl who'd lived in the building before us. The other mama says her daughter liked the same books I do, Yui told me one morning. She says we could be best friends if her daughter would just wake up from her long sleep. I began questioning whether our apartment might have some history I hadn't been told about. Kimura-san had mentioned that the previous tenant had moved out suddenly, but he'd attributed it to job relocation rather than any problems with the unit itself. My concern deepened when Yui began exhibiting unusual behavior. Some mornings I would find her bedroom door open and the balcony sliding door unlocked, despite my careful security routine. When I asked about it, Yui claimed the other mama had shown her how to open the locks quietly so they could sit together on the balcony. She misses her daughter so much, Yui explained with the earnest sympathy only children possess. I try to make her feel better by listening to her stories. The turning point came during my 4th week at the apartment. I returned home to find Yui still asleep, but standing on the balcony in her pajamas, her bare feet on the cold concrete. She was perfectly balanced against the railing, apparently sleepwalking, with her arms positioned as if someone were holding her hands. I woke her carefully, and she seemed confused about how she'd gotten outside. The other mama wanted to show me where her daughter used to play. She mumbled drowsily. She said we could play together if I came to visit her. That morning, I called in sick to work and took Yui to our family doctor. After a thorough examination, he found no medical issues that would explain the sleepwalking. He suggested the behavior might be stress-related, connected to our recent move and my nighttime work schedule. But I knew the situation required investigation beyond medical explanations. That afternoon, I visited the building manager, Tanaka-san, an elderly man who'd overseen the property for 15 years. I described Yui's experiences and asked directly about our apartment's history. Tanaka-san's expression grew grave. I was hoping you wouldn't need to know, he said quietly. The previous tenant, there was a tragedy. He explained that apartment 306, directly adjacent to ours, had been the site of a carbon monoxide poisoning incident 6 months earlier. A family of 3, mother, father, and 7-year-old daughter, had died in their sleep due to a faulty water heater. The incident had occurred during a cold snap in February, when the family had sealed their windows tightly against the winter air. The mother, Ogawa-san, was devoted to her daughter Emi-chan. Tanaka-san continued. Neighbors said she was an exceptionally caring parent, very protective, always worried about her child's welfare. The adjacent apartment had remained empty since the incident, officially classified as a Jiko-buken property. The disclosure period meant it would be difficult to rent for several years. But how could that affect our apartment? I asked. The tragedy occurred next door, not in our unit. Tanaka-san looked uncomfortable. Our building has shared balcony access on each floor. Apartments 305 and 306 have balconies that connect through a removable partition. The previous tenant of your unit moved out because she reported disturbances. A woman appearing on the balcony, trying to enter through the sliding door. I felt cold understanding settling over me. The other mama wasn't Yui's imagination, it was Ogawa-san, still searching for her daughter, still driven by the maternal instincts that hadn't died with her body. That evening, instead of going to work, I stayed home to observe what happened during the night hours. I tucked Yui into bed and positioned myself in the living room, where I could watch both her bedroom door and the balcony entrance. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the temperature in our apartment dropped noticeably. I heard the sliding door to the balcony move, despite my having locked it securely. Through the glass, I saw a pale figure in white moving across the shared balcony space. A woman with long black hair, wearing what appeared to be a nightgown. She approached our sliding door and pressed her face against the glass, peering into Yui's room. Her expression was desperate, searching, filled with the unmistakable anxiety of a mother looking for her child. I remained hidden, watching as she somehow manipulated the lock mechanism from outside. The door slid open silently, and she entered our apartment with the confident movements of someone familiar with the layout. She moved directly to Yui's room. From my position, I could see her sit on the edge of Yui's bed, gently stroking my daughter's hair. She spoke in whispers too soft for me to understand, but her gestures were unmistakably maternal, the careful, loving touches of a mother comforting her child. Yui stirred but didn't wake, instead moving toward the figure as if seeking comfort. The woman helped her stand and guided her toward the balcony, moving slowly and carefully, like someone leading a sleepy child to safety. I intervened at that point, calling out firmly but not harshly, "Ogawa-san, please stop." The figure froze, turning toward me with an expression of confusion and pain. For a moment, I could see her clearly, a woman perhaps my age, with the exhausted but determined look of a mother who'd been searching for her child for too long. "Emi-chan?" she whispered, looking between me and Yui. "Where is Emi-chan?" "Emi-chan is at peace," I said gently. "She's safe now. This is Yui, my daughter. You need to let her sleep in her own home." The woman looked at Yui with desperate longing, then back at me with growing understanding. Slowly, she released Yui's hand and stepped back toward the balcony. Before disappearing, she bowed deeply, the formal apology of someone who'd overstepped important boundaries. The next morning, I contacted a Buddhist monk, recommended by Tanaka-san, someone experienced with apartment-related spiritual disturbances. Monk Watanabe came to assess our situation and performed purification rituals throughout our unit, paying special attention to the balcony area and the wall we shared with the empty apartment next door. "Ogawa-san's maternal attachment is extremely strong," he explained. "Her death was sudden, unexpected, and occurred while she was in a protective state of mind. Her spirit seeks to continue caring for a child, and your daughter's presence has triggered those instincts." He placed protective omamori at our balcony door and taught me daily practices to maintain spiritual boundaries. "This will prevent her from entering your home," he said, "but it won't eliminate her presence entirely. Her grief is too profound for simple banishment." The protective measures worked. Yui stopped sleepwalking, and the other mama's visits to our apartment ceased. But sometimes, during the early morning hours when I return from work, I see a figure on the adjacent balcony, a woman in white standing at the railing, looking out over the park where children play during daylight hours. Yui occasionally asks about the other mama, wondering why she stopped visiting. I explain that the woman found peace and no longer needs to search for her daughter. But sometimes I catch Yui standing at our balcony door, looking toward the empty apartment with the sympathetic expression children reserve for sadness they don't fully understand. "She must be very lonely," Yui observed one morning. I continued working at the packaging plant and maintained our routine, but with new awareness of the spiritual vulnerabilities that come with discounted housing. Tanaka-san eventually told me more about the Ogawa family's final night, how Emi-chan had been suffering from a cold, how her mother had stayed up late caring for her, how the family had gone to sleep together in the main room to share warmth from a space heater. "They found them holding hands," he said quietly. "Ogawa-san had wrapped her arms around Emi-chan, even in death, trying to protect her." 6 months later, I still live in apartment 305. The rent remains affordable, and Yui has adjusted well to her school and neighborhood friends. But I've learned to respect the boundaries between the living and the dead, between maternal love that serves the living and maternal love that cannot accept loss. Sometimes, on nights when children in the building are crying from illness, nightmares, or the ordinary distresses of childhood, I hear sounds from the empty apartment next door. Soft footsteps, gentle humming, the sounds of a mother responding to a child's need for comfort. Ogawa-san continues her eternal watch, caring for children she cannot reach, trying to fulfill maternal obligations that death has made impossible. And while she no longer enters our home, I understand that her vigil continues on the balcony next door, where a mother's love persists beyond all rational boundaries. The most haunting part isn't the supernatural activity, it's recognizing my own protective instincts reflected in her desperate search. Every mother fears losing her child, fears being unable to provide the care and protection that defines our purpose. Ogawa-san's tragedy is that death interrupted those obligations without releasing her from them. Late at night, when I check on Yui's peaceful sleep, I sometimes think about the thin boundaries between normal maternal anxiety and the desperate spiritual attachment that binds Ogawa-san to this place. How easily love becomes obsession when loss disrupts the natural order of family life. And in those quiet moments, I understand why the other mama mistook my daughter for her own. In the darkness, guided by love and longing, all sleeping children might look like the ones we've lost. All peaceful faces might seem like the ones we're meant to protect. Laundry Day. My name is Sato, and I've been the building superintendent for Sakura Heights apartment complex in Sumida Ward for 12 years. In that time, I've learned that maintaining a building involves more than just fixing leaky faucets and collecting rent. Sometimes it means managing the lingering effects of tragedies that refuse to fade with time. Apartment 3B has been the source of my most persistent problems since the incident 3 years ago. The unit sits on the building's eastern side, with a balcony that faces the morning sun and provides an excellent view of the small courtyard where residents hang their laundry. It should be one of our most desirable units, but it's proven nearly impossible to keep occupied for more than a few months at a time. The trouble began in the spring of 2021, when our long-term tenant, Hayashi-san, took her own life. She'd been a model resident for 8 years, quiet, punctual with rent, meticulous about maintaining her apartment. Neighbors often commented on her dedication to housework, how her laundry always appeared on the balcony at precisely 9 a.m. every Tuesday, perfectly arranged and sparkling clean. Hayashi-san was a traditional housewife whose husband worked long hours at a construction company. She had no children, and after her mother-in-law's death the previous year, she'd seemed increasingly isolated. Neighbors noted that she'd become even more obsessive about cleaning, as if maintaining perfect domestic order could somehow fill the emptiness that had settled over her life. On the Tuesday she died, everything had appeared normal. Her laundry was hanging on the balcony as usual white shirts, arranged by size, towels folded and pinned with geometric precision. It was only when her husband returned from work that evening and found the apartment empty that we realized something was wrong. We found her in the utility closet, having used the same laundry rope she'd employed for hanging clothes. The police investigation concluded she'd completed her entire morning routine, washing, hanging, folding, before making her final decision. Her apartment was immaculate, with fresh sheets on the bed and dinner prepared for her husband's return. She wanted everything to be perfect, her husband told me through his tears. Even at the end, she was taking care of everyone else. The apartment remained empty for the required disclosure period, and even after that, we struggled to find tenants willing to overlook its history. The few who did move in rarely stayed long, reporting feelings of unease, unexplained temperature changes, and the persistent smell of laundry detergent even when no washing had been done. But the strangest reports came every Tuesday. Multiple tenants claimed to see wet clothes hanging on the balcony, visible from the courtyard and adjacent apartments, even when the unit was vacant. The clothes would appear at exactly 9 a.m. and remain until evening, when they would simply vanish. I investigated these claims personally, using my master key to check the apartment during the reported times. I never found any physical evidence. No wet clothes, no signs of entry, no disturbance to the empty rooms. But I did notice other oddities. The apartment was always meticulously clean, despite being vacant, and the utility closet consistently smelled of detergent and fabric softener. 6 months ago, I finally found a tenant willing to rent apartment 3B long-term. Akiko-san is a 28-year-old office worker who'd been searching for affordable housing near her job in the financial district. When I explained the apartment's history as required by law, she seemed unfazed. "I don't believe in ghosts," she said practically. "I just need a clean, quiet place to live." The rent reduction for the Jiko Buken classification made the unit attractive to someone working within a tight budget, and Akiko-san moved in during late October. For the first month, everything seemed normal. She established her own routines, including doing laundry on Sundays rather than Tuesdays. The problems began in December. Akiko-san approached me one Wednesday morning, looking confused and slightly embarrassed. "Sato-san, I think there might be a plumbing issue in my unit. Yesterday, I found my laundry hanging on the balcony, but I don't remember putting it there." She explained that she'd returned from work on Tuesday evening to find her freshly washed clothes hanging outside, arranged with precise spacing and geometric alignment that didn't match her usual casual approach to hanging. "Laundry. I thought maybe I'd hung them in the morning and forgotten," she said. "But I distinctly remember leaving the wet clothes in the washing machine because I was running late for work." I checked the balcony area for any maintenance issues that might explain the situation, but found nothing unusual. I suggested she might have hung the clothes out of habit and forgotten due to work stress. But the following Tuesday, the same thing happened. And the Tuesday after that. By January, Akiko-san's Tuesday routine had become completely predictable, though she seemed unaware of the pattern. Every Tuesday morning, at exactly 9 a.m., her laundry would appear on the balcony, arranged with the same meticulous precision that had characterized Hayashi-san's domestic habits. More troubling was Akiko-san's increasing obsession with cleanliness. She began mentioning how important it was to maintain proper standards, how a woman's worth could be measured by the order of her home. These weren't concepts she'd expressed when she first moved in, and they seemed to contradict her previously casual attitude toward housework. "A messy home reflects a messy mind," she told me one morning, repeating almost exactly what Hayashi-san used to say. I started monitoring apartment 3B more carefully, checking the courtyard view every Tuesday morning. At 9 a.m. precisely, I would see Akiko-san's laundry hanging on the balcony, white blouses arranged by size, towels folded and pinned with geometric precision, exactly matching the pattern Hayashi-san had followed for 8 years. But when I used my master key to check the apartment later that day, I would find Akiko-san at work and no evidence that laundry had been hung that morning. Her washing machine would be empty, her clothes still in the dresser. Yet the neighbors continued to see the clothes hanging outside every Tuesday, and security cameras in the courtyard consistently recorded the image of laundry on the balcony from 9 a.m. to sunset. The situation escalated in February. Akiko-san began calling in sick to work on Tuesdays, claiming she felt compelled to stay home and clean. She would spend the entire day washing, folding, and reorganizing her possessions with increasingly obsessive attention to detail. "I can't concentrate at the office on Tuesdays," she explained. "I keep thinking about all the cleaning that needs to be done at home." She started asking me detailed questions about Hayashi-san's cleaning methods, wanting to know which detergents she'd used, how she'd achieved such perfect results with her laundry routine. Akiko-san had never met Hayashi-san, yet she spoke about her as if they'd been close friends. She understood the importance of maintaining standards, Akiko-san said with increasing frequency. "A woman has responsibilities to her household, even if she lives alone." By March, I realized I needed professional intervention. I contacted Yamamoto-san, a Buddhist monk who specializes in apartment purifications and has helped our building with spiritual disturbances before. When Yamamoto-san examined apartment 3B, he immediately identified the source of the problem: The deceased's domestic routine has become spiritually embedded in the apartment structure, he explained. Her compulsive cleaning habits were so central to her identity that they continued after death. He pointed out that Hayashi-san's suicide had occurred not in despair, but in a state of completion. She'd finished all her domestic obligations and left everything perfect for her husband's return. Her death wasn't an escape from her role as a housewife, but the ultimate fulfillment of it. The new tenant is being drawn into that same pattern, Yamamoto-san warned. The spiritual residue of Hayashi-san's domestic devotion is contaminating Akiko-san's own relationship with housework. He performed purification rituals throughout the apartment, paying special attention to the utility closet where Hayashi-san had died, and the balcony where she'd hung her final load of laundry. He also placed protective omamori at key locations and taught me how to maintain spiritual barriers that would prevent the contamination from strengthening. This won't eliminate Hayashi-san's presence entirely, he cautioned. Her domestic obligations are too deeply ingrained, her sense of duty too strong. But it will protect the current tenant from being absorbed into that same obsessive pattern. The protective measures helped significantly. Akiko-san stopped calling in sick on Tuesdays and returned to her original casual approach to housework. She no longer spoke about domestic responsibilities or quoted Hayashi-san's philosophies about cleanliness. But every Tuesday at 9 a.m., laundry still appears on the balcony of apartment 3B. I can see it clearly from the courtyard, white garments, arranged with perfect precision, hanging in the morning sun exactly as they had for 8 years before Hayashi-san's death. The clothes are visible to everyone in the building, captured by security cameras, noted by neighbors who've learned to expect the weekly appearance. But when I check the apartment itself, I find it empty, with no physical evidence of laundry having been hung. Hayashi-san continues her Tuesday routine, maintaining the domestic standards that defined her life and, ultimately, her death. She hangs her invisible laundry with the same meticulous care she showed for 8 years, fulfilling obligations that death has made symbolic rather than practical. I've learned not to discuss the Tuesday laundry with new tenants. Those who notice it eventually adapt, accepting it as one of the building's quirks. Like the elevator that sometimes stops at non-existent floors, or the stairwell lights that occasionally turn on by themselves, the weekly laundry display has become part of our routine. What disturbs me most isn't the supernatural activity itself. It's recognizing how easily domestic routine can become a trap. Hayashi-san's dedication to housework had given structure and meaning to her isolated life, but it had also created a prison of repetitive obligations that she couldn't escape even through death. I think about her every Tuesday morning when I see the laundry hanging in the courtyard. A woman who found identity and purpose in maintaining perfect domestic order, whose sense of self was so tied to housework that she continues performing it decades after anyone benefits from her efforts. Sometimes I wonder if she realizes her husband moved away shortly after her death, remarrying within 2 years and starting a new family in Yokohama. The apartment she died to keep perfect now houses a young office worker who barely notices whether her clothes are arranged properly. But Hayashi-san's laundry still appears every Tuesday at 9 a.m., hanging in the morning sun with geometric precision, maintained by a dedication that transcends practical purpose. A reminder that some obligations become so fundamental to our identity that we continue fulfilling them long after they cease to matter to anyone else. And in the building's quiet morning hours, when sunlight illuminates the perfectly arranged clothes hanging on an otherwise empty balcony, I'm reminded of how thin the line can be between devotion and obsession, between taking pride in our work and being consumed by it. The night shift commute. My name is Takeshi, and I work the night shift at a packaging plant in Saitama. It's not glamorous work, but the pay is better than day shifts. and the schedule allows me to care for my elderly mother during daylight hours. While my sister works her office job, our family has always made sacrifices for each other. It's how we've survived since my father passed away 5 years ago. The commute to work requires taking the Keihin Tohoku line from Omiya to Urawa, then transferring to a local line that serves the industrial district. The last train that gets me to work on time departs at 11:47 p.m., running nearly empty, except for a few other night shift workers, late-night restaurant employees, and the occasional drunk salaryman heading home after overtime and drinking sessions. For 6 months, I've been taking this same train without incident. The late-night crowd is predictable, mostly tired working people like myself, who keep to themselves and avoid eye contact. We all understand the unspoken rules of Japanese train etiquette, especially during these quiet late-night hours when everyone just wants to get where they're going without disturbance. But 3 weeks ago, I began noticing the passenger in car 3, seat 14A. He's a middle-aged businessman, probably in his 40s, wearing a dark suit that would be unremarkable except for the stains across the front. At first glance, they look like coffee or food stains, the kind of accidents that happen during long workdays. But under the train's fluorescent lighting, the stains have a reddish-brown quality that suggests something more troubling. The man sits perfectly still during the entire journey, staring straight ahead with the vacant expression of someone completely exhausted. His posture is formal, hands folded in his lap, briefcase positioned precisely beside his feet. He never moves, never checks his phone, never shows any awareness of other passengers. What first drew my attention was his consistency. Every night I take the 11:47 train, he's there in the same seat, wearing the same stained suit, maintaining the same rigid posture. In Tokyo's constantly changing train population, such predictability is unusual enough to be noticeable. I began observing him more carefully, the way you do when something feels slightly off, but you can't identify exactly what. His suit, while clean except for the stains, appears older, not just worn, but somehow dated, as if he'd been wearing the same outfit for months. His hair is perfectly styled, but has an odd flatness, like hair that hasn't been properly washed in too long. More disturbing is his breathing pattern. I've learned to recognize the subtle rhythms of sleeping passengers during long commutes, but this man's breathing is different. Too shallow, too irregular, like someone who's holding their breath or struggling to breathe normally. After watching him for a week, I realized he never gets off the train. The 11:47 runs for 43 minutes, making 12 stops before reaching the end of the line at Minami Urawa. I get off at the 10th stop for my factory job. Every night, the businessman remains seated as passengers board and exit around him. He never acknowledges station announcements, never checks which stop is approaching, never shows any signs of preparing to disembark. During my break at work, I started wondering where he goes. Does he ride the train to the end of the line, then take the return journey? Is he homeless, using the train as shelter? Is he suffering from some kind of mental episode that leaves him trapped in repetitive behavior? My curiosity became concern when I noticed other passengers' reactions to him. The few regular night shift commuters like myself have begun avoiding car 3 entirely, choosing to stand in other cars even when seats are available. When I asked Yamamoto-san, a co-worker who takes the same train, if he'd noticed the businessman, his expression grew uncomfortable. "You see him too?" Yamamoto-san asked quietly. I thought maybe I was imagining it. He explained that he'd been avoiding car 3 for 2 weeks because something about the passenger in seat 14A made him feel uneasy. "There's something wrong about him," Yamamoto-san said. "Not dangerous wrong, just sad wrong. Like he doesn't belong there." That conversation prompted me to ask other regular passengers about the businessman. The responses were consistent. Everyone had noticed him. Everyone felt disturbed by his presence, but no one wanted to discuss it in detail. One older woman mentioned that she'd started taking an earlier train to avoid seeing him. "He makes me think of my late husband," she said softly. "The same tired look, the same way of sitting. But my husband is at peace now. That man, he doesn't look peaceful." 3 nights ago, I decided to ride the train to its final destination to see what happens to the businessman at the end of the line. I called in sick to work and took my usual seat in car 2, positioning myself where I could observe car 3 without being obvious about it. As the train progressed through its normal route, more passengers exited than boarded until only a handful of us remained. The businessman never moved, never showed any awareness that the train was reaching its final stops. When we reached Minami Urawa, the conductor made his standard announcement that all passengers must exit. I watched through the connecting door as other passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. The businessman remained seated, hands folded, staring straight ahead. The conductor entered car 3 to ensure all passengers had disembarked, walked directly past seat 14A, as if no one were sitting there, and continued his inspection. The businessman remained in his seat as the train emptied completely. I was the last passenger to exit, and as I stepped onto the platform, I could see him through the window, still sitting in perfect stillness, still staring ahead with that vacant, exhausted expression. The train pulled away toward the depot, carrying its impossible passenger into the night. The next morning, I visited the station office to ask about the late-night trains and whether they'd received any reports of unusual passengers. The station master, Ishida-san, listened to my description with growing concern. "A businessman in a stained suit?" he repeated. "Sitting in car 3, seat 14A?" When I confirmed these details, Ishida-san's expression became grave. He excused himself and returned with a folder of incident reports. After reviewing several documents, he found what he was looking for. "6 months ago," he said quietly, "a passenger jumped in front of the 11:47 train just outside Urawa Station. A salaryman, 42 years old, worked for a trading company. He'd been terminated that afternoon for poor performance related to alcohol problems. The investigation had revealed that Kimura-san, the deceased, had been riding the same train home from work every night for 8 years. His wife later told police that he'd been increasingly depressed about his job situation, drinking heavily, and expressing feelings of failure and shame about being unable to provide for his family. The train was delayed for 3 hours that night." Ishida-san continued. "Kimura-san was found with his briefcase and wearing his work suit. The impact occurred directly in front of car 3. I asked about the current train's route and discovered it was the same service, running the identical schedule that Kimura-san had used for his daily commute. The train had resumed normal operations after the incident was cleared and the investigation completed. We haven't received official reports about unusual passengers," Ishida-san said carefully. "But, informally, some staff members have mentioned feeling uncomfortable during late-night runs on this route. That evening, armed with this knowledge, I took my usual train to work. The businessman was in his customary seat, wearing the same stained suit, maintaining the same rigid posture. But now I understood what I was seeing, not a living passenger, but someone still trying to complete a journey that death had interrupted. The stains on his suit weren't coffee or food. They were the evidence of his final moments on the tracks, the blood stains that had marked his transition from life to whatever state he now occupied. He continued riding the train every night, because his routine had been so deeply ingrained that not even death could break it. But understanding his presence didn't make it less disturbing. If anything, knowing that Kimura-san was trapped in an eternal commute made the situation more heartbreaking. He'd died in despair, feeling like a failure, and now he was condemned to repeat the journey that had defined his working life. Over the following nights, I began to notice changes in his behavior. While he still maintained his rigid posture and vacant stare, he would occasionally turn his head slightly, when other passengers boarded car 3. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it seemed like he was becoming aware of the living passengers around him. More troubling was the effect he began having on others. Passengers who sat near him would become increasingly agitated during the journey, checking their phones obsessively, fidgeting with their belongings, showing signs of mounting anxiety. Several times I watched people abruptly get off at earlier stops than usual, as if compelled to escape the oppressive atmosphere in car 3. Last week, a young office worker who'd been sitting 2 seats away from Kimura-san began crying uncontrollably during the journey. When other passengers tried to help her, she could only say, "I feel so tired of everything." That incident convinced me that Kimura-san's despair was somehow contagious, that his spiritual presence was contaminating the emotional state of living passengers. I contacted a Buddhist monk, Fujiwara-san, who specializes in transportation-related spiritual disturbances. After I described the situation, Fujiwara-san confirmed my concerns. Suicide victims who die during routine activities often become trapped in those patterns, he explained. Their final emotional state in this case, despair and exhaustion, can influence others who share the same space. He arranged to ride the 11:47 train with me to assess the situation directly. When we boarded car 3, Fujiwara-san immediately identified Kimura-san's presence, though he appeared to see more than I could. "He's not just riding the train," Fujiwara-san observed quietly. "He's waiting for someone to join him. His isolation in death is so complete that he's trying to draw other passengers into his despair." Fujiwara-san performed a purification ritual at Urawa Station, focusing on the platform area where Kimura-san had died. He also placed protective omamori on several seats in car 3 and taught me specific prayers to recite during my commute. "I cannot force him to move on," Fujiwara-san explained. "His attachment to this routine is too strong and his despair too deep, but I can protect living passengers from being influenced by his emotional state." The protective measures have helped. The oppressive atmosphere in car 3 has lightened, and passengers no longer seem to be affected by proximity to Kimura-san. But he continues to ride the 11:47 train every night, maintaining his eternal commute between home and a job that no longer exists. "I still take the same train to work, and I still see him in seat 14A. He looks exactly the same, the dark suit with its terrible stains, the rigid posture, the vacant stare. But sometimes, just as the train pulls away from Urawa Station, the place where his life ended, I catch a glimpse of profound sadness in his expression. He'd been riding this train for 8 years, probably thinking about work problems, family responsibilities, the mounting pressures that eventually overwhelmed him. Now he continues the same journey eternally, trapped in the routine that had once given structure to his life but had ultimately become a pathway to despair." The most haunting aspect isn't the supernatural presence itself. It's recognizing how easily any of us could become trapped in similar patterns. How daily routines that seem normal and necessary can gradually erode our sense of purpose and hope. How the pressures of providing for family, meeting professional expectations, and maintaining social obligations can accumulate until they become unbearable. Every night, as I take my seat in car 2, I'm reminded that the line between normal stress and desperate hopelessness can be thinner than we'd like to believe. Kimura-san's eternal commute serves as a warning about what happens when the weight of daily obligations becomes too heavy to carry. And in the quiet moments, during the 43-minute journey to my factory job, I find myself grateful for work that pays the bills, family members who depend on me, and the simple fact that my own daily routine still has purpose and an endpoint I can look forward to reaching. Shared custody. My name is Imiko. And 6 months ago, I thought I'd found the perfect apartment for rebuilding our lives after my divorce. The unit in Narama Ward was spacious enough for my two children, 8-year-old Kenji and 5-year-old Sayuri, and priced 30% below market rate. After 18 months of legal battles and financial strain, the affordable rent seemed like exactly what we needed to start fresh. The divorce from Hiroshi had been bitter, fought over custody arrangements and support payments. As a part-time English teacher, my income barely covered our basic needs, while Hiroshi's construction company salary made him appear more financially stable to the family court. We'd settled on shared custody. The children would spend alternate weekends with their father, returning to me for the school week. The apartment seemed ideal for this arrangement. 3 bedrooms meant Kenji and Sayuri could each have their own space, important for children adjusting to the trauma of their parents' separation. The building was quiet, mostly occupied by young families and elderly couples, creating a safe environment for single motherhood. During our first month, everything progressed smoothly. The children adjusted to their new school. I established routines around my teaching schedule, and the weekend handoffs with Hiroshi proceeded without major conflict. Both kids seemed to be healing from the disruption of divorce, making friends in the building and neighborhood. Then Kenji mentioned Uncle Taro. It started casually during one of our evening conversations. Uncle Taro says Papa shouldn't shout so much when he visits, Kenji mentioned while we prepared dinner. I assumed he was talking about one of our neighbors, perhaps someone he'd met in the building's common areas. Who is Uncle Taro? I asked gently. Someone from school? He lives here with us, Kenji replied matter-of-factly. He plays games with me and Sayuri when Papa comes to pick us up. He doesn't like when Papa gets angry. Sayuri nodded enthusiastically. Uncle Taro taught me how to hide in the closet when people are loud, she added. He says children should be protected from angry voices. My first thought was that they'd created an imaginary friend to cope with the stress of custody exchanges. Divorce counselors had warned me that children often develop fantasy companions during difficult transitions, especially when they feel caught between conflicting parents. But the timing seemed specific. Uncle Taro apparently only appeared when Hiroshi visited. During our normal daily routines, neither child mentioned him. Only during the tense periods around weekend pickups and drop-offs would they reference this protective figure. I began paying closer attention during Hiroshi's visits. Our exchanges were usually brief but often strained. He would arrive Friday evening to collect the children, return them Sunday night, and our conversations rarely extended beyond logistics. But I noticed the children's behavior had changed during these transitions. Instead of their usual excitement about seeing their father, they seemed anxious, constantly glancing toward the hallway or their bedrooms, as if checking on something. When Hiroshi's voice would rise, which happened frequently when he disagreed with my parenting decisions, both children would move toward the back of the apartment, clustering near their bedroom doors. Uncle Taro says we should go to our rooms when adults argue, Sayuri explained one evening after a particularly heated exchange with Hiroshi. He says children don't need to hear angry words. The situation escalated 3 weeks ago when Hiroshi arrived early for his pickup, letting himself in with the key I'd forgotten to reclaim. He found the children playing quietly in Kenji's room and started lecturing them about being ready on time for their father. According to the children, Uncle Taro became very upset. He told Papa to stop shouting, Kenji reported later. Uncle Taro stood right in front of Papa and told him children should be treated with kindness. When I asked Hiroshi about the encounter, his reaction was dismissive but troubled. The kids were acting strange, he admitted. Kenji kept staring at empty space and talking to someone who wasn't there. It's probably just stress from the divorce. But his expression suggested he'd experienced something more unsettling than simple childhood imagination. The turning point came during last weekend's custody exchange. Hiroshi arrived Sunday evening to return the children, and I immediately noticed their agitated state. Both kids seemed frightened, staying close to me and repeatedly glancing toward the living room. "Uncle Taro is very angry," Sayuri whispered as I helped her with her backpack. "He doesn't want Papa to come here anymore." When I asked why, Kenji explained that their father had been drinking during the weekend, a visit something explicitly forbidden by our custody agreement, and had lost his temper when Sayuri spilled juice on his car's upholstery. "Uncle Taro says Papa hurt my feelings," Sayuri added quietly. "He says he won't let Papa make us cry anymore." I confronted Hiroshi about the drinking, which led to another argument in our entryway. As our voices rose, I noticed the apartment's temperature seemed to drop noticeably. Both children retreated to their rooms, and I heard what sounded like furniture moving, though no one was in those areas. Hiroshi's demeanor changed abruptly. He stopped mid-sentence, staring past me toward the hallway, with an expression of confusion and growing unease. "Someone's here," he said quietly. "Someone's watching us." I turned to look, but saw nothing unusual. "It's just the children in their rooms," I replied. "No," he insisted, backing toward the door. "There's a man standing right there. He's angry." Hiroshi left quickly, and I spent the evening trying to understand what had happened. The children spoke about Uncle Taro with increasing frequency, describing him as a sad man who worried about children being hurt by their parents. "He used to have children too," Kenji told me, "but they couldn't visit him anymore, and it made him very sad. Now he wants to protect us." That conversation prompted me to research our apartment's history. I contacted the real estate agent, Nakamura-san, and asked directly about previous tenants. Initially reluctant to discuss details, he eventually admitted there had been a domestic situation in our unit the previous year. The previous tenant, Watanabe-san, had been a divorced father whose custody arrangement had been terminated due to alcohol problems and inappropriate behavior during visitations. On a weekend when his children were supposed to visit before the court order preventing contact, he had taken his own life in the apartment. He was found in the children's bedroom, Nakamura-san explained reluctantly. Neighbors reported he'd been drinking heavily and crying loudly about losing his family. The apartment had been classified as a Jiko Buken property, requiring disclosure for 3 years. Most potential tenants had declined to rent once they learned the history, which explained the significant discount in our rent. "We hoped a family with children might ease the atmosphere," Nakamura-san admitted. "Sometimes properties with difficult histories respond well to positive family energy." But instead of being eased, Watanabe-san's protective instincts had apparently been triggered by our family situation. Our custody arrangements, the presence of children who needed protection, and the conflicts with Hiroshi had awakened his paternal spirit. I contacted a Buddhist monk, Suzuki-san, who specializes in apartment purifications and child-related spiritual disturbances. After visiting our home and speaking with the children about Uncle Taro, he confirmed my fears. Watanabe-san's death occurred during a state of extreme paternal distress, Suzuki-san explained. "His desire to protect children has attached to your family, but his judgment is influenced by his own traumatic experiences with custody loss." He warned that the spirit's protective instincts could become increasingly territorial, especially toward male figures who might be perceived as threats to the children's well-being. Hiroshi's drinking and anger during visits had marked him as a danger in Watanabe-san's spiritual assessment. "This type of attachment can escalate," Suzuki-san cautioned. "The deceased father may try to prevent any contact between the children and their living father, seeing himself as their true protector." Suzuki-san performed purification rituals throughout the apartment, focusing on the children's bedrooms and the areas where Watanabe-san had died. He also placed protective omamori at strategic locations and taught me daily practices to maintain spiritual boundaries. "I cannot banish him completely," he explained. "His attachment to protecting children is too strong, and your family situation too similar to his own trauma. But I can establish boundaries that prevent his interference from becoming dangerous. The protective measures have helped stabilize the situation. Uncle Taro still appears according to the children, but his interactions have become less intense. He no longer tries to directly confront Hiroshi during visits, though the children report that he watches carefully and provides comfort when needed. However, the custody arrangement has become more complicated. Hiroshi, deeply unsettled by his supernatural encounters, has requested that weekend visits take place at his apartment rather than mine. While this reduces direct conflict, it also means the children spend more time traveling between homes. Papa doesn't like coming here anymore, Kenji observed recently. Uncle Taro makes him nervous. I continue living in the apartment because moving would mean financial hardship and disrupting the children's school adjustment. But I've had to accept that our family now includes an invisible protector whose standards for child welfare don't always align with legal custody arrangements. The most challenging aspect is helping the children understand appropriate boundaries. While Uncle Taro's protective instincts seem genuine, I worry about them becoming too dependent on supernatural intervention rather than learning to navigate family conflicts through communication and proper channels. Uncle Taro says he'll always watch over us, Sayuri mentioned last week. Even if we move to a different house, he'll make sure we're safe. That comment concerns me because it suggests Watanabe-san's attachment may extend beyond our current apartment. His desperate need to fulfill paternal obligations that death prevented him from completing could follow our family wherever we go. During quiet evenings when the children are asleep, I sometimes sense his presence, a melancholy watchfulness that pervades our home. It's not malevolent, but it carries the weight of a father's love that couldn't be expressed properly during life, and now seeks outlet through protecting other people's children. The irony isn't lost on me that our family, broken by divorce and custody battles, has become the focus of a dead father's displaced parental instincts. Watanabe-san lost his children through his own failures and choices, but his love for them persisted beyond death, finding expression through caring for children who remind him of what he lost. Sometimes I wonder if this arrangement serves everyone's needs. The children feel protected and valued. I have help managing Hiroshi's more difficult behaviors, and Watanabe-san gets to fulfill the fatherly duties that were taken from him. But I also worry about the psychological impact of supernatural dependency and what happens when the children grow up and no longer need protection. Late at night, when the apartment is completely quiet, I occasionally hear sounds from the children's bedrooms, gentle footsteps, soft voices, the sounds of someone checking on sleeping children. It's the behavior of a loving father making sure his family is safe, except the father is dead and the children aren't his own. The most haunting aspect isn't the supernatural activity itself. It's recognizing how thoroughly parental love can transcend the normal boundaries of life, death, and family relationships. Watanabe-san's inability to care for his own children has created a desperate need to protect any children within his sphere, regardless of legal or biological connections. And in the early morning hours, when sunlight fills our apartment and the children wake up feeling safe and loved, I'm reminded that some forms of protection come from unexpected sources. Even if that protection carries the weight of another parent's unresolved grief and unfulfilled obligations. The delivery that never came. My name is Yuki, and I work the night shift at Family Mart in Katsushika Ward. It's not the career I planned when I graduated from university with a literature degree, but the economy has been difficult, and night shift work pays enough to cover my student loans while I search for something better. The store stays open 24 hours, serving the neighborhood's shift workers, insomniacs, and late-night delivery drivers who need coffee and convenience foods during the quiet hours. Above the store, there's a small apartment building where several of our regular customers live. It's a modest 4-story structure built in the 1990s, housing mostly young office workers and students who appreciate the convenience of having Family Mart directly below their homes. The arrangement works well for everyone. Residents can grab necessities without traveling far, and we have a reliable customer base during slow nighttime hours. I've been working this shift for 8 months, and I've learned the building's rhythms. Most residents are asleep by midnight, leaving the store quiet, except for occasional late-night customers and delivery drivers, bringing food orders to people who work unusual schedules or simply prefer staying awake during nighttime hours. The disturbances began 2 months ago, always following the same pattern. Every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., someone rings the doorbell of apartment 2C. The sound is distinctive. 3 sharp rings in rapid succession, followed by complete silence. The building's intercom system connects to our store, so I can hear the buzzing clearly during the quiet pre-dawn hours. At first, I assumed it was a delivery driver with a late-night order, though 3:15 seemed unusually late even for 24-hour delivery services. But when I checked our security monitors, which cover the building's entrance and stairwell, I never saw anyone approaching the building or waiting at the door. The ringing would occur precisely on schedule, but the entrance area remained empty. No delivery drivers, no residents returning home, no one who could have pressed the buzzer for apartment 2C. After a week of this phenomenon, I started checking apartment 2C's status. According to the building's resident directory, the unit had been vacant for 6 months. The mailbox was empty except for advertising flyers, and no lights ever appeared in the windows during my night shifts. Yet, every night, someone rang the doorbell for the empty apartment. I mentioned it to Takahashi-san, the day shift manager, thinking there might be an electrical problem with the intercom system. He seemed puzzled but not particularly concerned. "Old buildings have quirks," he said practically. "Maybe it's a short circuit or sensitivity to temperature changes. Has anyone complained about it?" The building's other residents hadn't mentioned any problems, which seemed strange if they were being awakened by doorbell ringing every night. I started paying closer attention to the second floor during the 3:15 incidents, but never noticed lights turning on or signs of disturbance from adjacent apartments. It was as if only I could hear the ringing. 3 weeks ago, I decided to investigate more directly. When the 3:15 doorbell rang, I left the store briefly to check the building's entrance. The front door was securely locked, the stairwell empty, and no signs that anyone had been there recently. But as I climbed to the second floor to examine apartment 2C's door, I noticed something unusual. The area immediately outside the apartment felt noticeably colder than the rest of the hallway. The temperature difference was subtle but unmistakable, like standing near an air conditioning vent. More strange was the faint smell of food, something like ramen or yakitori, the kind of late-night meals that delivery drivers typically carry. The smell was fresh, as if someone had just brought hot food to the door. I pressed my ear against apartment 2C's door and heard nothing from inside. The unit was definitely vacant, with no sounds of occupancy or daily life. But the food smell persisted, concentrated right outside the door, as if someone were standing there holding a delivery order. When I returned to the store, I researched the building's history, and apartment 2C specifically. The building manager, Endo-san, was helpful, but seemed reluctant to discuss details about the vacant unit. There was an incident several months ago, he admitted when I pressed for information. A delivery driver. There was an accident in the stairwell. Since then, the apartment has been difficult to rent. He explained that a 28-year-old delivery driver named Sato-san had suffered a heart attack while climbing to the second floor with a late-night food order. He was found the next morning in the stairwell, still clutching the delivery bag containing ramen and side dishes ordered by apartment 2C's previous tenant. The stress of night work, poor diet, too much caffeine, Endo-san said sadly. These delivery drivers work such difficult schedules. Sato-san had been working double shifts to pay for his mother's medical treatments. The apartment 2C tenant had moved out shortly after the incident, disturbed by the association with Sato-san's death. Since then, several potential renters had viewed the unit, but none had signed leases, often citing vague feelings of unease or discomfort. The building has been quiet since then, Endo-san noted. No problems with other residents, no complaints about noise or disturbances. But he seemed to be avoiding something in his explanation. When I asked about the exact timing of Sato-san's death, his expression grew troubled. The order was placed at 2:45 a.m., he said quietly. Sato-san would have arrived around 3:15, given the delivery distance and building access. That timing matched exactly with the nightly doorbell ringing. Armed with this knowledge, I began observing the 3:15 phenomenon with new understanding. It wasn't an electrical malfunction or random disturbance, it was Sato-san, still trying to complete his final delivery. The next night, when the doorbell rang at 3:15, I immediately checked the security monitors. The entrance area appeared empty as usual, but I noticed something I'd missed before. On the monitor, displaying the second-floor hallway, there was a faint shadow near apartment 2C's door, just a subtle darkening of the area, as if someone were standing there. Over the following nights, I started leaving the store during the 3:15 incidents to observe more closely. Each time, I found the same evidence: the cold spot outside apartment 2C, the smell of fresh food, and the sense that someone was waiting patiently at the door. But no one ever answered. On the monitor, I could sometimes catch glimpses of movement never clear enough to identify a figure, but consistent with someone shifting their weight while waiting or reaching toward the doorbell. The shadow would linger for several minutes after the ringing, then gradually fade. Last week, I contacted a Buddhist monk, Hayashi-san, who specializes in work-related spiritual disturbances. When I described the situation, he immediately understood what was happening. Sato-san died while fulfilling his professional duty, Hayashi-san explained. His sense of responsibility was so strong that death didn't release him from the obligation to complete the delivery. He visited the building to assess the situation and confirmed that Sato-san's spirit was indeed trapped in a loop, attempting to deliver food to an apartment that no longer had a tenant to receive it. He died with the delivery bag in his hands, focused entirely on completing his work, Hayashi-san observed. That level of dedication has created a spiritual attachment to the task. The monk performed purification rituals in the stairwell where Sato-san had died and outside apartment 2C where he'd been trying to deliver the order. He also placed protective omamori at key locations and explained the situation to Endo-san. I cannot force him to abandon the delivery, Hayashi-san cautioned. His work ethic is too fundamental to his identity, but I can help him understand that the task no longer needs to be completed. The spiritual intervention helped somewhat. The 3:15 doorbell ringing stopped being a daily occurrence, reducing to perhaps 3 times per week, but it didn't eliminate the phenomenon entirely. Sato-san still appears some nights, still trying to complete his final delivery. The difference is that his attempts seem less urgent, more resigned. Instead of the sharp, insistent ringing of someone expecting an immediate response, the doorbell now sounds like someone fulfilling a duty they know has become pointless. I continue working the night shift at Family Mart, and I've grown accustomed to Sato-san's periodic visits. When I hear the 3:15 doorbell, I no longer feel alarmed or curious, just sad, for someone whose dedication to work transcended the normal boundaries of life and death. Endo-san eventually told me more about Sato-san's circumstances. He'd been working for multiple delivery companies, pulling 12 to 14-hour shifts to afford his mother's cancer treatments. The night he died, he'd already completed 8 hours of delivery work and was starting a second shift for additional income. He was a good young man, Endo-san said, always polite, always careful with the building's property. He would bow and apologize if he was even slightly late with the delivery. That level of conscientiousness, combined with the financial pressure that drove him to overwork, had created a spiritual attachment to professional duty that persisted beyond death. The most disturbing aspect isn't the supernatural activity itself. It's recognizing how easily work obligations can become so central to our identity that we continue fulfilling them even when they no longer serve any purpose. Sometimes, during quiet moments in the store, I think about all the delivery drivers who work through the night carrying food to people who prefer staying awake during the dark hours. They navigate empty streets, climb countless stairs, and maintain schedules that prioritize customer service over their own health and well-being. Sato, San's eternal delivery route, serves as a reminder of how thoroughly work can consume our sense of self, creating obligations that feel more important than life itself. His dedication to completing that final delivery reflects the pressure so many workers feel to maintain perfect professional standards, regardless of personal cost. When I hear the 3:15 doorbell now, I sometimes whisper a quiet acknowledgement toward the second floor. Thank you for your hard work, Sato-san. The customer knows you tried your best. It seems like the least I can do for someone whose sense of duty was so strong that not even death could release him from it. The building eventually found a new tenant for apartment 2C, a nurse who works night shifts at a nearby hospital. She was told about the history and seemed unfazed by the supernatural associations. I understand about work that never really ends, she said when Endo-san explained about Sato-san. Some obligations feel too important to abandon. Since she moved in 3 weeks ago, the 3:15 doorbell ringing has stopped completely. Perhaps Sato-san finally feels his delivery has been received by someone who understands the dedication it represents. Or perhaps he's moved on to other deliveries, continuing his route through Tokyo's endless network of apartments, where people work through the night and depend on others to bring them sustenance during the dark hours. Either way, the second-floor hallway no longer smells like food at 3:15 a.m., and the cold spot outside apartment 2C has returned to normal temperature. But during my quiet night shifts, I sometimes find myself listening for the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the careful, purposeful steps of someone carrying precious cargo and determined to complete their appointed rounds. In the pre-dawn darkness, when the city sleeps but the work never truly stops, I'm reminded that some forms of service create bonds stronger than death itself. And somewhere in Tokyo's maze of delivery routes, the commitment to bring comfort to others during their longest, loneliest hours continues without regard for the normal boundaries between life and duty. The helpful neighbor. My name is Tanaka, and at 74 years old, I've learned to appreciate the small kindnesses that make daily life manageable. Since my wife Masako passed away 3 years ago, I've been living alone in our apartment in Itabashi Ward, managing household tasks that she'd handled for 48 years of marriage. Cooking, shopping, keeping track of supplies, these things don't come naturally to me, but I'm slowly learning to care for myself. Our apartment building is older, constructed in the early 1980s, with thin walls and close quarters that foster neighborly relationships. Most residents are elderly, like myself, people who've lived here for decades and formed the quiet bonds that sustain us through the challenges of aging. We check on each other informally, share occasional meals, and offer help when needed. My daughter Sachiko lives in Chiba with her own family and visits when her schedule permits, usually bringing groceries and ensuring I'm eating properly. Her care package visits have become my lifeline. She restocks my kitchen, prepares meals I can reheat, and handles shopping tasks that have become difficult for me to manage alone. 6 weeks ago, I began noticing that my kitchen supplies were being replenished more frequently than Sachiko's visits would account for. It started with rice. I distinctly remembered running low on the premium koshihikari that Sachiko always brings me. But when I checked the cupboard, I found a fresh 5-kilogram bag positioned exactly where I keep my rice supply. The bag was the same brand and variety she usually purchases, placed with the careful attention to organization that characterizes her shopping. I assumed she'd made an extra trip to help me out, perhaps stopping by while I was taking my afternoon walks in the neighborhood park. Sachiko has keys to my apartment and often arrives when I'm out, leaving groceries and sometimes cleaning or organizing while I'm away. But when I called to thank her, she seemed confused. "I haven't been to your apartment in 3 weeks, Papa," she said gently. "Are you sure about the rice? Maybe you forgot you had some stored away." I checked my memory carefully, but I was certain the cupboard had been nearly empty. Yet there was the rice bag, positioned precisely where it belonged, as if placed by someone familiar with my kitchen's organization. Over the following weeks, other items began appearing: miso paste, cooking sake, dried seaweed, pickled vegetables, all the staples of traditional Japanese cooking that form the foundation of my daily meals. Each item appeared in exactly the right location, organized with the meticulous care that had characterized Masako's kitchen management. The mystery deepened when I started finding prepared dishes. Small portions of cooked vegetables, seasoned tofu, simmered fish, simple, wholesome food, perfectly suited to an elderly person's dietary needs. The dishes would appear in my refrigerator, carefully wrapped and labeled with cooking dates in handwriting I didn't recognize. More puzzling was the quality of the food. It was prepared exactly to my taste, preferences: not too salty, properly seasoned, cooked to the soft texture that my aging teeth could handle comfortably. Someone was preparing meals specifically for my needs, but I couldn't identify who had such detailed knowledge of my dietary requirements. I began monitoring my apartment more carefully, looking for signs of who might be entering and when. All doors and windows remained securely locked, and I found no evidence of forced entry or disturbance. Yet the food continued appearing, always when I was out for my daily walk or afternoon rest. 3 weeks ago, I decided to test the situation. I deliberately emptied my refrigerator of prepared foods and made a mental inventory of exactly which items remained in my cupboards. Then I took an unusually long walk, extending my normal route to give whoever was helping me ample time to visit. When I returned, I found my refrigerator stocked with fresh meals, and my cupboards replenished with items I'd deliberately used up. The food was still warm, suggesting it had been prepared recently, and the arrangement showed the same careful attention to organization I'd come to expect. But this time, I noticed something else. The apartment carried a faint scent of cooking, not just the food that had been left, but the lingering aromas of someone who'd been actively preparing meals in my kitchen. The smell of miso soup, steamed rice, and simmered vegetables hung in the air, as if someone had just finished an elaborate cooking session. I began asking neighbors about any unusual activity in the building. Most residents keep to themselves, but Mrs. Yamamoto from the 3rd floor mentioned that she'd noticed cooking smells coming from various apartments at unusual times. "Sometimes I smell wonderful food cooking late at night or early in the morning," she said. "It reminds me of my, quote, grandmother's kitchen. But when I try to identify which apartment it's coming from, the smell seems to disappear." Her comment prompted me to pay attention to the building's overall atmosphere. Several neighbors mentioned similar experiences: the smell of home cooking, when no one should be cooking, the sense that someone was moving through the hallways caring for residents who needed help. My concern shifted from gratitude to unease when I realized the implications. Someone was entering my apartment regularly, preparing food and organizing my supplies. While the intentions seemed benevolent, the situation represented a significant invasion of privacy and security. I contacted the building manager, Ito-san, to ask about any maintenance or care services that might explain the mysterious assistance. His reaction was immediate and troubled. "You're experiencing the food deliveries too?" he asked. "You're the 3rd resident to mention this phenomenon." He explained that several elderly residents had reported similar experiences, kitchen supplies appearing, prepared meals being delivered, cooking assistance that none of them had requested or could explain. All the recipients were elderly, living alone, and struggling with the daily tasks of meal preparation and nutrition management. We've checked for unauthorized entry, reviewed security measures, investigated possible service providers, Ito-san said. There's no external explanation for what's happening. He seemed reluctant to discuss other possibilities, but when I pressed for more information, he revealed the building's recent history. Apartment 3B, adjacent to yours, was occupied by Watanabe-san until her death 8 months ago. She was 81, lived alone, but was known throughout the building for her generous spirit and constant care for other residents. Watanabe-san had been the building's unofficial caretaker, regularly checking on elderly neighbors, bringing them home-cooked meals, and ensuring everyone had adequate food and supplies. She'd maintained this role despite her own advancing age and declining health. She died of natural causes in her sleep, Ito-san continued, but the apartment has remained empty since then. The family found it too difficult to clean out her belongings. She'd accumulated decades of cooking supplies, preserved foods, and ingredients for the meals she prepared for others. The apartment had become what real estate law classifies as a jikobuken property, not because of unnatural death, but because of the difficulty in renting a unit so strongly associated with its previous occupants' caring activities. Watanabe-san's kitchen was like a community resource. Ito-san explained. She knew everyone's dietary preferences, health requirements, and food sensitivities. Losing her left many residents struggling with nutrition and meal preparation. That conversation prompted me to research Watanabe-san's life and her relationship with building residents. Neighbors described her as someone whose identity was completely wrapped up in caring for others, particularly elderly people who could no longer manage cooking tasks independently. She would spend entire days preparing meals for different residents, Mrs. Yamamoto told me. Her apartment always smelled like a restaurant kitchen. She seemed to live entirely for the purpose of feeding other people. The night after learning about Watanabe-san, I decided to stay awake and observe what happened during the early morning hours, when the mysterious cooking typically occurred. I positioned myself in my living room, with a clear view of both my kitchen and the hallway outside my door. At approximately 2:30 a.m., I heard the familiar sounds of cooking coming from my kitchen, the soft bubbling of soup, the sizzle of vegetables being prepared, the gentle clink of dishes being arranged. But when I moved to investigate, I found my kitchen empty and unchanged. The cooking sounds continued for nearly an hour, accompanied by the aromas of a traditional Japanese breakfast being prepared with careful attention to nutritional balance and flavor. I could hear ingredients being chopped, rice being washed, soup being seasoned, all the familiar sounds of someone preparing a meal with love and expertise. When the sounds stopped, I found my kitchen stocked with exactly the kind of breakfast that would be appropriate for an elderly person's dietary needs. The food was perfectly prepared and still warm, arranged with the care of someone who understood both cooking techniques and the recipient's health requirements. I contacted a Buddhist monk, Ogawa-san, who specializes in spiritual attachments related to caregiving and domestic activities. After visiting my apartment and the empty unit next door, he confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Watanabe-san's identity was so completely centered on caring for others that death hasn't released her from those obligations, he explained. Her generous spirit continues trying to fulfill the community role that gave her life meaning. He performed purification rituals throughout both apartments, focusing on the kitchen areas and the wall we shared with Watanabe-san's former home. He also placed protective omamori at strategic locations and taught me daily practices to maintain spiritual boundaries. I cannot eliminate her desire to care for you, Ogawa-san cautioned. Her generosity is too fundamental to her spiritual nature, but I can help establish boundaries that acknowledge her kindness while maintaining your independence. The spiritual intervention changed the situation, but didn't eliminate it entirely. The mysterious food deliveries became less frequent, and I regained a sense of control over my own kitchen. But occasionally, especially when I'm struggling with cooking or running low on supplies, I still find helpful additions to my meals and pantry. The difference is that now I understand what's happening. Watanabe-san continues her caring routine because it's the only way she knew how to express love and maintain connections with other people. Her death didn't release her from the obligations that had defined her entire adult life. I've learned to accept her help gracefully, while maintaining my own independence. When I find prepared meals or restocked supplies, I offer a quiet word of thanks toward Apartment 3B, acknowledging her continued generosity while making it clear that I'm managing my daily needs. Sometimes, during the early morning hours, when the building is quiet, I hear the faint sounds of cooking coming from the empty apartment next door. Watanabe-san continues preparing meals for residents who need help, expressing love through the only language she ever mastered completely. Sachiko visits more frequently now, partly out of concern for my well-being, and partly because she finds the situation fascinating rather than frightening. "It sounds like you have a guardian angel," she says. "Someone who cares enough to make sure you're eating properly." Her perspective helps me appreciate the situation rather than feeling disturbed by it. In a society where elderly people often struggle with isolation and inadequate nutrition, having someone who continues to care even from beyond death represents a form of blessing rather than burden. The building's other elderly residents have similar relationships with Watanabe-san's continued presence. We've learned to accept the mysterious assistance while maintaining our dignity and independence. Her help supplements our self-care rather than replacing it. What strikes me most is how thoroughly caregiving can become someone's entire identity. Watanabe-san had no family of her own, no career outside the domestic sphere, no interests that didn't involve nurturing other people. Taking care of neighbors wasn't just something she did, it was who she was. In death, that identity persists because it was the only way she knew how to connect with the world around her. Her generous spirit can't conceive of abandoning people who still need help, even though her physical ability to provide assistance has ended. Late at night, when I smell the familiar aromas of someone cooking with love and attention, I'm reminded that some forms of generosity transcend the normal boundaries between life and death. Watanabe-san's kitchen continues operating because caring for others was never just a hobby or obligation. It was her way of expressing the deepest truths about connection, community, and the ways we sustain each other through life's difficulties. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when an elderly woman's spirit prepares meals for neighbors who still need nourishment, I find comfort in knowing that some bonds of care and community are strong enough to survive any transition. Practice makes perfect. My name is Mai, and I've been teaching piano in my apartment for 12 years. It's not the most lucrative career, but the flexibility allows me to care for my elderly mother while maintaining some financial independence. My home studio in Koto Ward serves neighborhood children whose parents want them to develop musical skills without the expense of formal conservatory training. The apartment itself is modest but adequate for my needs. The main room houses my upright piano and serves as the lesson space, while my mother occupies the bedroom and I sleep in the small tatami room that doubles as storage for sheet music and teaching materials. It's cramped but functional, and the location near an elementary school provides a steady stream of potential students. For over a decade, this arrangement worked perfectly. I built a reputation for patient, thorough instruction, helping children develop both technical skills and genuine love for music. My students regularly placed well in local competitions, and several went on to study music seriously in high school and university. Then apartment 4F, directly above mine, became the source of the most unusual disturbance I've ever encountered. 6 months ago, every evening at exactly 8 p.m., I began hearing piano music from the unit above. At first, I assumed a new tenant was practicing, though the timing seemed oddly consistent for someone's personal practice routine. The music was always the same piece, Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11 in A major, specifically the first movement. What made it strange wasn't just the repetition, but the quality of the performance. The playing showed technical competence, but with persistent errors in the same measures, as if someone were struggling with specific passages, but never improving despite constant practice. As a professional instructor, I found the situation both intriguing and frustrating. The performer clearly had some skill, but was making fundamental mistakes that proper guidance could easily correct. I could hear hesitation at challenging transitions, rushed passages where confidence faltered, and a particular struggle with the ornamental runs in measures 32 through 36. After 2 weeks of this nightly routine, I decided to introduce myself to the new neighbor and offer assistance. When I knocked on apartment 4F's door at 9 p.m., just after the practice session ended, no one answered. The hallway was silent, and no lights were visible under the door. I tried several more times over the following week, always immediately after the 8 to 9 p.m. practice sessions. The apartment appeared vacant, with no signs of occupancy beyond the mysterious piano playing. Concerned about unauthorized use of the building, I contacted the landlord Ito-san to ask about the current tenant status of apartment 4F. His reaction was immediate and troubled. "That apartment has been empty since the incident last year," he said carefully. "We haven't found anyone willing to rent it yet." When I described the nightly piano playing, his expression grew grave. He explained that apartment 4F had been the site of a tragic accident the previous spring. A 14-year-old piano student named Hana-chan had fallen from the balcony during a lesson with her private instructor. The police investigation concluded it was accidental, Ito-san said. The girl had been practicing near the open balcony door during a warm evening. She apparently became dizzy and fell while standing to turn pages of her sheet music. The apartment had remained vacant since then, officially classified as a Jiko Buken property due to the unnatural death. The family had removed the piano and all furniture, leaving the unit completely empty. "But if you're hearing piano music," Ito-san said quietly, "that's concerning. There's no piano in that apartment anymore." That conversation should have ended my curiosity, but instead it intensified my attention to the nightly performances above. Now that I knew the apartment was empty, the consistent 8 to 9 p.m. piano playing became genuinely disturbing rather than merely puzzling. More troubling was recognizing the piece being played. Mozart's Sonata No. 11 is a standard repertoire piece for intermediate students, challenging enough to demonstrate technical development, but accessible enough for teenagers to master with proper instruction. It was exactly the type of piece a 14-year-old would be working on for recitals or competitions. 3 weeks after learning about Hana-chan, one of my current students began exhibiting unusual behavior during lessons. 12-year-old Yuki-chan, who'd been studying with me for 2 years, suddenly became obsessed with learning Mozart's Sonata No. 11, despite my recommendations that she focus on pieces more suited to her current skill level. "I hear someone playing it upstairs," she explained during our Tuesday evening lesson. "I want to learn it so I can play along." I tried to redirect her attention to more appropriate repertoire, but Yuki-chan insisted on working on the Mozart piece. More concerning was her approach to learning it. She seemed to instinctively know the fingering and phrasing, as if she'd been practicing it extensively, despite never having seen the sheet music before. As she played through the first movement, I was startled to hear her make the exact same errors I'd been hearing from apartment 4F. The hesitation at challenging transitions, the rushed passages, the particular struggle with measures 32 through 36. Yuki Chan's performance mirrored the phantom pianist upstairs with disturbing precision. "Where did you learn this fingering?" I asked, after she finished playing. "I don't know," she replied, looking confused. "It just feels right in my hands." Over the following weeks, Yuki Chan's obsession with the Mozart piece intensified. She would arrive early for lessons and stay late, practicing the same movement repeatedly with the same persistent errors. Her technical skills were adequate for the piece, but she seemed unable to correct the specific mistakes that plagued her performance. More disturbing was her behavior during the 8 to 9 p.m. window, when the phantom pianist above was most active. If Yuki-chan happened to be having a lesson during that time, she would become agitated and distracted, constantly glancing toward the ceiling and losing focus on whatever piece we were working on. "Can we practice the Mozart now?" she would ask. "I can hear her playing it upstairs, and I want to try to match her tempo." The situation escalated when other students began experiencing similar phenomena. Kenji-kun, a 10-year-old who'd never shown interest in classical repertoire, suddenly insisted on learning the same Mozart sonata. Like Yuki-chan, he seemed to instinctively know fingering patterns and made identical errors in identical measures. Within a month, 3 of my students had become obsessed with the same piece, all exhibiting the same technical mistakes, and all claiming they could hear someone playing it in the apartment above during their lessons. I contacted a Buddhist monk, Saito-san, who specializes in music-related spiritual disturbances. After visiting my apartment and the empty unit above, he confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Hana-chan's muscle memory and musical knowledge have created a strong spiritual attachment to that particular piece, he explained. Her desire to complete the performance she was working on when she died has contaminated the musical space below. He pointed out that apartment 4F shared floor vibrations and acoustic resonance with my studio. The phantom piano playing was Hana-chan's attempt to finish the Mozart sonata she'd been practicing when the accident occurred. Young musicians often form intense emotional connections to pieces they're learning, Saito-san continued. When death interrupts that learning process, the spiritual attachment can persist, seeking completion through other students. He performed purification rituals throughout both apartments, focusing on the areas where pianos had been positioned and the acoustic pathways between floors. He also placed protective omamori at strategic locations and taught me specific practices to maintain spiritual boundaries during lessons. "I cannot eliminate Hana-chan's desire to complete her musical studies," he warned. "Her dedication to improvement is too strong, and her attachment to that particular piece too deep. But I can help prevent her influence from overwhelming your living students." The spiritual intervention helped significantly. The nightly piano playing from apartment 4F became less frequent, and my students stopped exhibiting the obsessive behavior that had characterized their approach to the Mozart piece. They returned to working on age-appropriate repertoire and developing their skills naturally. But Hana-chan's presence hasn't disappeared entirely. Occasionally, usually during the evening hours, when she would have been taking lessons, I hear the familiar sounds of someone practicing Mozart Sonata No. 11 in the empty apartment above. The phantom performance has evolved slightly since the purification. The persistent errors that once characterized the playing have begun to improve, as if Hana-chan is slowly mastering the technical challenges that troubled her during life. The hesitation at difficult passages has diminished, and the ornamental runs are becoming more confident. Sometimes, when I'm teaching in the evening and hear the phantom piano above, I find myself listening critically and offering mental guidance to the invisible student. "Slow down the left hand in measure 28. I think toward the ceiling. Don't rush the transition into the development section." It's become a strange form of posthumous mentorship, helping a dedicated student complete her musical education despite the boundaries between life and death. My current students occasionally ask about the piano sounds from upstairs, but the intensity of their interest has returned to normal levels. They hear the phantom playing as background noise rather than compelling musical instruction that demands their participation. Someone practices a lot up there, Yuki-chan observed recently. She's getting better at that Mozart piece. I continue teaching in my apartment studio, and the arrangement works well for both my students and my family responsibilities. But I've developed a new appreciation for how thoroughly music can become embedded in a student's identity, creating attachments that transcend normal learning boundaries. Late at night, when the building is quiet, and I'm preparing lesson materials for the next day, I sometimes hear Hana-chan working through particularly challenging passages, repeating measures until she achieves the precision she's seeking. Her dedication to improvement continues with the same intensity she showed during life. The most haunting aspect isn't the supernatural activity itself. It's recognizing how completely music education can shape a young person's sense of purpose and achievement. Hana-chan's identity as a piano student was so fundamental that death couldn't release her from the obligation to master the piece she'd been working on. In quiet moments between lessons, I'm reminded that some forms of learning create bonds stronger than the normal boundaries between teacher and student, between aspiration and achievement, between life and the eternal pursuit of musical perfection. And in the evening hours when apartment 4F fills with the sound of someone practicing Mozart with patient determination, I find myself grateful to witness such dedication to musical excellence, even when it originates from beyond the normal realm of pedagogy. Sometimes the most devoted students are those whose love of learning transcends every limitation, including death itself. Hana-chan continues her musical education because the pursuit of beauty and technical mastery was never just a hobby or obligation. It was her way of connecting with something larger than herself. Her nightly practice sessions serve as a reminder that true musical education creates relationships that persist long after the formal lessons end, bonds between student and art that no interruption can permanently sever. The Elevator Companion. My name is Rina, and I work as an administrative assistant at a financial planning firm in Shibuya. It's demanding work with long hours, but the salary allows me to afford a small apartment in a modern high-rise building in Meguro Ward. The commute is manageable, and living on the 15th floor gives me a sense of space that's rare in Tokyo's cramped housing market. The building itself is relatively new, constructed in 2018, with all the modern amenities, automated parking, security systems, and high-speed elevators that make living on the upper floors practical rather than burdensome. Most residents are young professionals like myself, people who work demanding jobs and appreciate the building's efficient, anonymous atmosphere. For the first 8 months I lived there, everything functioned exactly as advertised. The elevators were fast and reliable. The building was quiet and well-maintained, and the location offered convenient access to shopping and transportation. It seemed like the perfect solution for a single woman navigating Tokyo's competitive work environment. Then I began noticing the elevator's unusual behavior. It started subtly. During my evening commute home from work, I would enter the elevator in the lobby, press the button for the 15th floor, and watch as the car rose smoothly toward my destination. But consistently, every evening, the elevator would make an unscheduled stop at the 7th floor. The doors would open to reveal an empty hallway, remain open for approximately 30 seconds, then close and continue to my floor as if nothing unusual had occurred. At first, I assumed someone on the 7th floor was calling the elevator but changing their mind or running late to catch it. But after 2 weeks of this identical pattern, I started paying closer attention. The elevator would stop at the 7th floor, even when I hadn't seen anyone press the call button in the lobby. The hallway was always empty when the doors opened. with no signs that anyone had been waiting or had just departed. More puzzling was the timing. The unscheduled stop occurred only during my evening rides home, usually between 7 and 8 p.m. During morning trips to work or weekend errands, the elevator functioned normally, taking me directly to my destination without interruption. I mentioned the elevator's behavior to Yamamoto-san, the building manager, thinking there might be a technical malfunction with the call system. He seemed puzzled, but not particularly concerned. Elevators in modern buildings have sophisticated computer systems, he explained. Sometimes there are minor glitches that work themselves out over time. Has it caused any serious delays or safety issues? Since the stops added only a minute or two to my commute, I hadn't considered it a serious problem. But I asked him to check whether any residents on the 7th floor had reported issues with elevator service. I'll look into it, he promised, though his tone suggested it wasn't a high priority. A week later, Yamamoto-san called to discuss the elevator situation. I've reviewed the service logs and spoken with 7th floor residents, he reported. There are no recorded maintenance issues, and no one on that floor has reported problems with elevator response. But he seemed reluctant to end the conversation there. Have you noticed anything else unusual about the 7th floor stops? Any patterns or unusual circumstances? I described the consistent timing and the empty hallways, and his response was telling. I think I should tell you about the building's history, he said carefully. 6 months before I moved in, there had been an incident involving a resident of apartment 7C, Nakamura-san, a 42-year-old woman undergoing treatment for terminal cancer, had taken her own life by jumping from her balcony rather than returning to the hospital for what would have been her final round of chemotherapy. She'd been fighting the illness for 2 years, Yamamoto-san explained, in and out of the hospital constantly, spending more time in medical wards than at home. The night she died, she was supposed to check back into the hospital the following morning. The apartment had remained vacant since then, officially classified as a Jiko-buken property due to the unnatural death. The family had found it too difficult to clean out her belongings, particularly the medical equipment and supplies that had accumulated during her long illness. But what does that have to do with the elevator? I asked. Yamamoto-san was quiet for a moment. Nakamura-san spent her final months essentially living between the hospital and her apartment. She was very weak toward the end, and the elevator was how she traveled between her home and the ambulance or taxi trips to medical appointments. He paused, then continued more quietly. The last time anyone saw her alive, she was waiting for the elevator in the court, 7th floor hallway. A neighbor reported seeing her in her hospital gown, apparently preparing to go downstairs for her ride back to the medical center. That conversation changed my perception of the evening elevator stops entirely. Now that I knew apartment 7C was empty and associated with Nakamura-san's final journey, the unscheduled stops took on a more disturbing significance. The next evening, when the elevator stopped at the 7th floor and the doors opened to reveal the empty hallway, I found myself looking more carefully at the space beyond. The corridor appeared normal, clean, well lit, quiet, but there was something about the atmosphere that felt different from other floors. The air seemed somehow thinner, colder, carrying a faint antiseptic smell that reminded me of hospitals. And while the hallway appeared empty, I had the distinct feeling that someone was standing just outside my line of sight, waiting patiently for the elevator doors to open. Over the following weeks, my awareness of the 7th floor stops intensified. The 30-second pause began to feel longer, more charged with expectation. I started noticing details I'd previously overlooked. The way the elevator's lighting seemed dimmer during these stops, the subtle change in air pressure, the almost imperceptible sense of movement just beyond the doors. 3 weeks ago, I finally saw her. As the elevator stopped at the 7th floor and the doors opened, I caught a glimpse of someone standing in the hallway, a slight woman in a pale hospital gown, positioned near apartment 7C's door. She was facing the elevator, as if she'd been waiting for it to arrive. But she didn't board. She simply stood there, hands at her sides, with the patient, resigned expression of someone accustomed to waiting for transportation to medical appointments. Her appearance was exactly what I'd expected. Thin, pale, exhausted, but with the quiet dignity of someone who'd fought a long, difficult battle. The doors closed after the usual 30 seconds, and the elevator continued to the 15th floor. But the image of the woman in the hospital gown remained vivid in my mind. She'd looked directly at me with recognition, as if she'd been expecting my presence in the elevator. From that point forward, I saw Nakamura-san every evening during the 7th floor stop. Always in the same position, always wearing the same pale hospital gown, always with the same patient expression. But she never attempted to board the elevator. I began to understand what was happening. Nakamura-san was trapped in an eternal routine, waiting for transportation that would take her away from the hospital environment that had dominated her final months. But having chosen death over returning to medical treatment, she was unable to board any elevator that might take her back to the suffering she'd tried to escape. I contacted a Buddhist monk, Tanaka-san, who specializes in medical-related spiritual disturbances. After hearing my description of the situation, he confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Nakamura-san's final act was a rejection of medical intervention, he explained. Her spirit continues to seek transportation away from the hospital environment, but her choice to die, rather than return for treatment, has created a spiritual conflict she cannot resolve. He visited the building to assess the situation and performed purification rituals in the elevator and throughout the 7th floor. He also met with Yamamoto-san to discuss the empty apartment and the ongoing spiritual activity. I cannot eliminate her desire for escape from medical treatment, Tanaka-san cautioned. Her fear of returning to the hospital is too strong, and her attachment to this building too deep. But I can help establish boundaries that acknowledge her presence without allowing it to disturb other residents. The spiritual intervention helped somewhat. The evening elevator stops became less frequent, and when they did occur, the atmosphere felt less charged with desperation. Nakamura-san still appeared occasionally, but her expression seemed more peaceful, less urgent. But she continues to wait for the elevator, still wearing the hospital gown she died in, still seeking transportation to anywhere except the medical wards where she spent her final suffering months. I've learned to accept these evening encounters as part of my commute routine. When the elevator stops at the 7th floor and I see Nakamura-san waiting patiently in the hallway, I offer a quiet nod of acknowledgement. It seems like the least I can do for someone whose final months were spent traveling between home and hospital, seeking comfort in an apartment that represented the only space where she wasn't defined entirely by illness. Sometimes I wonder what she thinks about during those eternal waits for transportation that never comes. Does she remember the medical appointments, the treatments, the constant journey between hope and despair that characterized her final years? Or does she simply exist in the moment, between calling for the elevator and deciding where she wants to go? The building's other residents have begun to notice the elevator's unusual behavior, though most assume it's a technical glitch that will eventually be repaired. A few have mentioned seeing someone on the 7th floor during evening hours, but these sightings are usually dismissed as glimpses of other residents or visitors. I continue living on the 15th floor, and the apartment meets my needs perfectly despite the supernatural complications. But I've developed a new appreciation for how thoroughly medical treatment can dominate a person's sense of home and mobility. Late at night, when the building is quiet and I'm preparing for the next day's work, I sometimes think about Nakamura-san's final choice between returning to the hospital or finding another way to end her suffering. Her decision to jump from the balcony rather than board the transportation that would take her back to chemotherapy represents the ultimate rejection of medical intervention. And in the evening hours, when the elevator stops at the 7th floor, revealing a woman in a hospital gown who waits for transportation to anywhere except the place where illness defined her existence. I'm reminded of how profoundly medical treatment can shape our relationship with home, mobility, and the simple act of choosing where we want to go. Her eternal wait serves as a haunting reminder that some forms of suffering create spiritual attachments so strong that not even death can provide the escape we seek. Nakamura-san continues to seek transportation away from medical treatment, but her choice to die rather than continue fighting has left her unable to board any vehicle that might complete her journey. The most disturbing aspect isn't the supernatural presence itself, it's recognizing how easily the boundary between medical care and suffering can blur, creating situations where home becomes simply a rest stop between hospital stays and elevators become symbols of the constant travel between sickness and the hope for healing. In those quiet moments when the elevator doors open to reveal someone still waiting for a ride to freedom, I understand why some journeys can never be completed, even with all the transportation options in the world. Mother's Little Helper. My name is Kazuko, and I work as a live-in caregiver for elderly clients who need constant assistance with daily activities. It's challenging work, both physically and emotionally, but the steady income allows me to support my own teenage daughter while she finishes high school. The arrangement also provides housing, which is essential given Tokyo's expensive rental market for single mothers. My current client is Hayashi-san, an 86-year-old woman suffering from moderate dementia who lives alone in a traditional house in Setagaya Ward. Her family hired me 6 months ago when her condition deteriorated to the point where she could no longer safely manage cooking, bathing, and medication without supervision. Hayashi-san is generally pleasant and cooperative, though her memory fluctuates significantly from day to day. Some mornings she recognizes me immediately and can hold coherent conversations about current events. Other days she seems confused about where she is or mistakes me for various people from her past, usually her late sister or childhood friends from decades ago. The most consistent aspect of her confusion involves her deceased daughter, Noriko-san. According to the family, Noriko died in a car accident 3 years ago while driving to visit her mother during a particularly severe episode of Hayashi-san's illness. Since then, Hayashi-san has persistently insisted that Noriko still visits regularly, usually in the afternoons, to help with household tasks and provide companionship. Noriko will be here at 3 o'clock. Hayashi-san announces almost every day during lunch. She always comes to help me prepare tea and fold the laundry. She's such a devoted daughter. Initially, I assumed this was a common manifestation of dementia. Patients often maintain vivid memories of deceased family members and sometimes experience hallucinations involving loved ones. I gently redirect her attention when she mentions Noriko's visits, neither confirming nor contradicting her statements. But 3 weeks into my employment, I began noticing phenomena that couldn't be explained by Hayashi-san's mental condition alone. It started with the tea service. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, I would find the formal tea set arranged perfectly in the living room, the good china that Hayashi-san rarely uses, positioned with precise attention to traditional tea ceremony placement. The teapot would be warm, cups arranged for 2 people, and small sweets arranged on delicate plates. At first, I thought Hayashi-san had prepared the tea service during moments when I was busy with other tasks. Dementia patients sometimes experience periods of clarity where they can perform complex familiar activities. But when I asked her about the afternoon tea preparation, she seemed genuinely surprised. "Oh, that's Noriko's doing," she would say matter-of-factly. "She always prepares tea when she visits. I've taught her the proper way since she was a little girl." More puzzling was the quality of the tea service. The arrangement showed expertise in traditional tea ceremony, techniques that Hayashi-san, in her current condition, would struggle to execute consistently. The proportions were perfect. the temperature ideal, and the presentation reflected years of practiced skill. After 2 weeks of mysterious afternoon tea services, I began finding other evidence of household assistance I hadn't provided. Origami cranes would appear on Hayashi-san's bedside table, delicate paper figures, folded with precision and arranged in small clusters. Laundry would be found perfectly folded and organized in ways that didn't match my usual methods. Most mysteriously, meals would sometimes be partially prepared when I returned from brief errands. Vegetables cut with perfect uniformity, rice measured and ready for cooking, soup ingredients arranged with the careful attention to nutrition and presentation that characterizes traditional Japanese family cooking. Noriko helped me prepare dinner. Hayashi-san would explain when I asked about the food preparation. She knows exactly how I like everything arranged. Such a thoughtful daughter. I began monitoring Hayashi-san more carefully during the afternoon hours, when these mysterious activities seemed to occur. But I never observed her actually preparing tea services or folding origami. During the times when she claimed Noriko was visiting, Hayashi-san would sit quietly in her chair, occasionally speaking to empty air but showing no signs of the physical activity required for the household tasks being completed. Yet the evidence continued appearing: perfectly prepared tea, expertly folded origami cranes, partially completed meal preparations that demonstrated cooking skills beyond what Hayashi-san could currently manage independently. 4 weeks ago, I decided to investigate the situation more systematically. I positioned myself where I could observe the living room during the afternoon hours, while appearing to be occupied with other tasks. At exactly 3 o'clock, Hayashi-san's demeanor would change noticeably. She would smile brightly and begin speaking as if someone had just entered the room. "Noriko-chan, you're right on time," she would say to empty space. "I was just thinking we should have tea together." During these conversations, Hayashi-san would respond to unheard questions, nod as if listening to detailed explanations, and react with the natural rhythm of someone engaged in genuine dialogue. Her responses suggested she was receiving specific information about family matters, household concerns, and daily activities. While Hayashi-san conversed with her invisible daughter, I began noticing subtle changes in the room's atmosphere. The temperature would drop slightly, and there would be a faint sense of movement, not visible directly, but perceptible in peripheral vision. The kind of activity that suggests someone moving efficiently through familiar household tasks. During one of these afternoon sessions, I watched carefully as the tea service appeared to arrange itself. Cups moved into position with deliberate precision. The teapot was filled and heated without any visible agent, and small sweets were placed on appropriate serving dishes. The work was completed with the smooth efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times. Most remarkably, Hayashi-san seemed completely aware of what was happening. She would thank empty air for bringing the tea, comment on the quality of the sweets, and engage in detailed discussions about proper household management techniques. "You've always been so helpful, Noriko-chan," she would say warmly. "Even as a child, you wanted to learn everything about taking care of a home." I contacted the family to ask about Noriko-san's relationship with her mother and her involvement in household activities before her death. Hayashi-san's son, Takeshi-san, was initially reluctant to discuss his sister, but eventually provided helpful context. "Noriko visited every day after mother's dementia diagnosis," he explained. "She was obsessed with maintaining mother's routines, making sure she ate properly, keeping the house exactly as it had always been. She felt responsible for preserving mother's dignity and independence." He described Noriko as someone whose identity was completely wrapped up in filial duty and family caregiving. She had never married, lived nearby, and devoted herself entirely to supporting their aging mother. "The day she died, she'd been rushing here because mother had called, confused and frightened about something," Takeshi-san continued. "Noriko dropped everything at work and was driving over to help. The accident happened 3 blocks from this house. The family had found it difficult to discuss Noriko's death with Hayashi-san due to her dementia. Rather than repeatedly explain that her daughter was gone and cause fresh grief each time, they had simply allowed her to maintain her belief that Noriko still visited regularly. We thought it was a harmless delusion that brought her comfort, Takeshi-san admitted. We had no idea she was actually experiencing visits. I contacted a Buddhist monk, Watanabe-san, who specializes in family-related spiritual disturbances and elder care situations. After visiting the house and observing one of the afternoon tea sessions, he confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Noriko-san's sense of filial duty was so strong that death didn't release her from her caregiving obligations, he explained. Her mother's continued need for assistance has kept her spiritually bound to this house and these daily routines. He pointed out that dementia patients often maintain stronger connections to deceased family members because their rational skepticism is diminished. Hayashi-san's belief in Noriko's continued presence had created an environment where the spiritual activity could manifest more easily. Noriko died while fulfilling her duty to her mother, Watanabe-san observed. Her final act was rushing here to provide care. That dedication has persisted beyond death. He performed purification rituals throughout the house, focusing on the areas where household activities typically occurred, and the rooms where Noriko had spent the most time during her caregiving visits. He also placed protective omamori at strategic locations and taught me practices to maintain spiritual boundaries. I cannot eliminate Noriko's desire to care for her mother, he cautioned. Her filial devotion is too fundamental to her identity, but I can help establish boundaries that honor her dedication while ensuring it doesn't become overwhelming. The spiritual intervention changed the dynamic but didn't eliminate Noriko's presence entirely. The afternoon tea services became less elaborate, and the household assistance became more subtle. But Hayashi-san continues to report daily visits from her daughter, and I continue to find evidence of help with cooking and household organization. The difference is that now I understand what I'm witnessing. Noriko's afternoon visits aren't delusions created by dementia. They're the continuation of a caregiving routine that was so central to her identity that even death couldn't interrupt it. I've learned to work collaboratively with Noriko's presence rather than being disturbed by it. When I find perfectly prepared tea or expertly folded origami, I acknowledge the assistance quietly and ensure that Hayashi-san's needs are being met comprehensively. Thank you for helping with the tea service, Noriko-san. I sometimes whisper toward empty air. Your mother appreciates your continued care. The arrangement works well for everyone involved. Hayashi-san feels supported by her daughter's daily visits. I receive help with household tasks that would be difficult to manage alone, and Noriko continues fulfilling the filial obligations that gave her life meaning. Sometimes, during the quiet afternoon hours when Hayashi-san is napping and I'm preparing dinner, I sense Noriko moving through the house, checking on her mother, organizing supplies, maintaining the domestic order that she'd spent years perfecting. Her presence is gentle, purposeful, and completely focused on ensuring her mother's comfort and dignity. The most remarkable aspect isn't the supernatural assistance itself. It's witnessing how thoroughly filial duty can transcend the normal boundaries between life and death. Noriko's devotion to her mother was so complete that dying while rushing to provide care simply became another form of service, rather than an end to her caregiving responsibilities. Late at night, when the house is completely quiet and Hayashi-san is sleeping peacefully, I sometimes hear soft footsteps in the hallway and gentle sounds of someone checking to ensure all is well. Noriko continues her evening rounds, making sure her mother is safe, comfortable, and properly cared for. Her eternal caregiving routine serves as both comfort and reminder that some forms of love create obligations so profound that not even death can release us from them. In a society where filial duty remains a fundamental virtue, Noriko's continued devotion represents the ultimate expression of family loyalty. And in the peaceful afternoon hours, when Hayashi-san enjoys tea with her invisible daughter, speaking about daily concerns and family memories, I witness a form of love that transcends every limitation, including the boundary between life and death. The origami cranes that appear on Hayashi-san's bedside table each morning now seem less like supernatural manifestations and more like daily expressions of a daughter's continuing care. Each delicate paper figure represents another day of devotion, another small act of love that connects mother and daughter across the divide that death creates. In caring for elderly clients, I've learned that some relationships are so fundamental they persist regardless of physical presence. Noriko's afternoon visits remind me that the deepest bonds of family love find ways to express themselves even when conventional caregiving becomes impossible. The Substitute Family. My name is Daiichi, and I've been raising my 4-year-old son Hiro alone since my wife left us 18 months ago. It's not the life I planned, but single fatherhood has taught me priorities I never understood before: stability, routine, and finding housing we can afford on my salary as a warehouse supervisor in a dachi ward. When I found our current apartment, a 2-bedroom unit for 58,000 yen per month, I thought we'd finally achieve the stable home environment Hiro needed. The price was reasonable for the space, the building was quiet, and the location near a kindergarten made our daily routine manageable. After months of struggling with temporary housing and expensive short-term rentals, signing a proper lease felt like a victory. The apartment itself is modest but adequate. Hiro has his own small bedroom decorated with his favorite toy trains, and I've set up the living room as a play space where we spend our evenings together. The kitchen is large enough for basic cooking, and the building's laundry facilities work well for our weekly washing routine. For the first month, everything progressed smoothly. Hiro adjusted to his new bedroom, made friends with children in the building, and seemed to be thriving in the stable environment I'd worked so hard to provide. His behavioral problems, anxiety, sleep disturbances, regression in toilet training that had emerged during our housing instability began to improve. Then Hiro began mentioning the other daddy. It started casually during one of our morning conversations over breakfast. "The other daddy says I'm a good boy," Hiro announced while eating his rice and eggs. "He read me a story last night when you were working late. I'd been required to work overtime the previous evening and hadn't returned home until nearly midnight." Our neighbor Suzuki-san, an elderly woman who lives across the hall, had agreed to watch Hiro for a few hours and reported that he'd gone to bed without any problems. "What other daddy?" I asked gently, assuming he was talking about an imaginary friend or perhaps confusing a story character with reality. "He comes when you're not here," Hiro explained matter-of-factly. "He knows all the same bedtime stories you know, but he's sadder than you are." I assumed this was Hiro's way of processing my absences during work obligations. Single children often develop imaginary companions, especially during stressful periods when their primary caregiver is frequently away. The family counselor we'd consulted about his adjustment issues had mentioned that fantasy friends are common coping mechanisms for children dealing with family disruption. Over the following weeks, Hiro's references to the other daddy became more frequent and detailed. According to my son, this mysterious figure would visit during my late work shifts, help with bedtime routine, and provide comfort when Hiro felt lonely or frightened. "He knows exactly how you tuck me in," Hiro told me one evening. "He does the blanket the same way and checks the closet for monsters just like you do." The specificity of these details began to concern me. Hiro described bedtime rituals that matched my own methods, precisely the order in which I arranged his stuffed animals, the particular way I adjusted his nightlight, even the specific phrases I used to reassure him about nighttime fears. More troubling was Hiro's emotional attachment to these visits. He would look forward to my late work evenings with unusual enthusiasm, as if anticipating something special rather than dreading my absence. "Will the other daddy come tonight?" he would ask when I mentioned working overtime. He promised to finish reading the train book with me. 3 weeks ago, I decided to investigate more systematically. I arranged with Suzuki-san to watch Hiro during one of my overtime shifts, but I returned home earlier than scheduled to observe what was actually happening during these mysterious visits. When I arrived at our apartment around 10 p.m., Suzuki-san reported that Hiro had been sleeping peacefully since 8:30. "No problems at all," she assured me. "He went to bed on schedule and hasn't made a sound." But when I checked on Hiro, I found him sitting up in bed, apparently engaged in conversation with someone I couldn't see. He was responding to unheard questions, nodding as if listening to instructions, and showing the relaxed, happy demeanor he typically displays during quality time with me. "Daddy's home early," he announced to empty air. "The other daddy says you must have finished work quickly tonight." I sat on his bed and asked who he was talking to, but Hiro seemed confused by the question. "The other daddy," he repeated, looking toward the corner of his room where I saw nothing unusual. "He's right there. Can't you see him?" The next morning, I contacted the building manager, Tanaka-san, to ask about our apartment's history and whether there might be security issues I should know about. His reaction was immediate and troubled. "You're experiencing something unusual in your unit?" he asked carefully. "Has your son mentioned visitors?" When I described Hiro's reports about the other daddy, Tanaka-san's expression grew grave. He explained that our apartment had been the site of a tragedy 2 years ago. The previous tenant, Miyamoto-san, had taken his own life after losing custody of his 5-year-old son in a bitter divorce proceeding. He was devastated by the court decision, Tanaka-san said quietly. Neighbors reported hearing him crying loudly for weeks before the incident. He'd been a devoted father, and losing contact with his son destroyed him. The apartment had remained vacant for over a year, officially classified as a Jikobuken property due to the unnatural death. Several potential tenants had viewed the unit but declined to rent after learning its history. "We hoped a family with a young child might ease the atmosphere," Tanaka-san admitted. "Sometimes properties with difficult histories respond well to positive family energy." But instead of being eased, Miyamoto-san's paternal instincts had apparently been triggered by our presence. Our family situation, a single father, raising a young son, mirrored his own circumstances before the custody loss that had driven him to suicide. That evening, I decided to stay home and observe what happened during Hiro's bedtime routine. I tucked him in normally, but instead of leaving his room, I positioned myself where I could watch, without being obvious about my presence. At approximately 9 p.m., Hiro's behavior changed noticeably. He sat up in bed and began speaking as if someone had just entered his room. His tone was warm and familiar, like he was greeting a beloved family member. "You came back," Hiro said happily to empty space. "I was hoping you would read the rest of the train story tonight." For the next 30 minutes, I watched my son interact with an invisible presence that appeared to be reading him bedtime stories. He would turn pages in his picture book, respond to unheard questions about the story, and laugh at appropriate moments as if someone were providing commentary or asking about his favorite parts. Most disturbing was how natural and comfortable these interactions seemed. Hiro wasn't talking to himself or engaging in solitary play. He was clearly responding to another person's presence, following conversational rhythms and behavioral cues that suggested genuine interaction. When the invisible bedtime routine concluded, Hiro settled back into his bed with the satisfied, peaceful expression he typically shows after quality time with me. "Thank you for the story," he said toward the corner of his room. "Will you come back tomorrow night if Daddy has to work late?" I contacted a Buddhist monk, Yoshida-san, who specializes in family-related spiritual disturbances and child psychology. After visiting our apartment and speaking with Hiro about his experiences with the other daddy, he confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Miyamoto, San's death occurred in a state of profound parental grief, Yoshida-san explained. His desire to care for his son was so strong that it persisted beyond death, seeking expression through other children who need fatherly attention. He pointed out that Hiro's age and family situation closely matched Miyamoto, San's own son at the time of the custody loss. Our single-father household had created an environment where the deceased man's paternal instincts could manifest as protective, nurturing behavior. This isn't malevolent activity, Yoshida-san assured me. Miyamoto-san is trying to fulfill the fatherly duties that were taken from him during life. But his attachment to this apartment and to the role of father could become problematic if it interferes with your own parental relationship with Hiro. Yoshida-san performed purification rituals throughout our apartment, focusing on Hiro's bedroom and the areas where Miyamoto-san had spent time during his final months. He also placed protective omamori at strategic locations and taught me practices to maintain appropriate spiritual boundaries. I cannot eliminate Miyamoto-san's desire to be a father, he cautioned. That need is too fundamental to his identity, but I can help ensure that his presence supports rather than replaces your role as Hiro's actual parent. The spiritual intervention helped establish clearer boundaries around the supernatural activity. Hiro still occasionally mentions the other daddy, but these interactions have become less frequent and less intense. The invisible bedtime stories continue sometimes, but they no longer seem to compete with my own parental responsibilities. Most importantly, Hiro now seems to understand the difference between his real father and the supernatural presence that occasionally provides comfort. He still enjoys the other daddy's visits, but doesn't rely on them or prefer them to time spent with me. The other daddy is nice, Hiro told me recently, but you're my real daddy. He told me that himself. I continue working at the warehouse and managing our household routine, adapting to the reality that our family occasionally includes a supernatural presence who shares my dedication to Hiro's well-being. It's not the normal family dynamic I'd envisioned, but it works for our circumstances. Sometimes, during the quiet evening hours when Hiro is playing independently, I sense Miyamoto-san's presence watching over my son with the protective attention of someone who understands how precious and fragile the father-child relationship can be. His spiritual presence serves as a reminder that parental love, once awakened, never truly diminishes, even when circumstances make it impossible to express through normal channels. The most profound aspect isn't the supernatural activity itself. It's recognizing how thoroughly fatherhood can become someone's core identity. Miyamoto-san lost everything when he lost access to his son, and death didn't release him from the paternal obligations that had defined his sense of purpose and worth. Late at night, when our apartment is quiet and Hiro is sleeping peacefully, I sometimes offer a quiet word of gratitude toward the presence that helps watch over my son when my work obligations require my absence. Thank you for caring about him, I whisper into the darkness. I understand what it means to be a father. And in those moments, I feel a profound connection with someone whose love for his child transcended every limitation, including death itself. Miyamoto-san's continued presence in our lives serves as both blessing and warning about how completely fatherhood can consume our sense of identity and purpose. His eternal vigil reminds me that some bonds between parent and child are so fundamental that they persist beyond the normal boundaries of life, creating obligations that no court decision, no family tragedy, and no physical limitation can permanently sever. In the peaceful bedtime hours when Hiro drifts off to sleep, knowing that multiple sources of paternal care are watching over him, I'm reminded that love, once given to a child, never truly ends. Even when circumstances make direct expression impossible, the protective instincts of devoted parents find ways to continue their most important work. And somewhere in the quiet corners of our home, a father's love that couldn't be extinguished by loss continues to provide comfort, protection, and the gentle bedtime stories that help children feel safe in a world that can sometimes take away the people we need most. Closing time. My name is Sachiko, and I've been managing a Family Mart convenience store in Sumida Ward for 8 years. It's demanding work, 12-hour shifts, constant customer service, inventory management, and the responsibility of maintaining a 24-hour operation that serves the neighborhood's diverse needs. But the job provides steady income and advancement opportunities that have allowed me to support my elderly parents while building my own financial security. Our store sits on a busy corner near a train station, serving everyone from salarymen grabbing coffee during their commutes to elderly residents picking up daily necessities. The location is excellent for business, but also attracts transient populations, delivery drivers taking breaks, construction workers buying lunch, and occasionally homeless individuals seeking temporary shelter from weather or simply a place to rest. Like most convenience stores, we maintain strict policies about loitering and unauthorized presence in the store. Corporate guidelines require us to discourage people from lingering without making purchases, especially during late-night hours when security concerns increase. It's not personal, it's simply business policy designed to maintain a safe, comfortable environment for paying customers. For 7 years, this approach worked without major incidents. We developed relationships with regular customers, maintained good standing with the community, and operated efficiently within corporate standards. The store's automatic doors, security cameras, and well-lit interior created an environment that felt welcoming to customers while discouraging problematic behavior. Then, 6 months ago, we began experiencing unusual disturbances during closing procedures. Every night after we shut down the store at midnight, I would hear someone attempting to activate the automatic entrance doors. The sound is distinctive, the mechanical whir of sensors detecting movement, followed by the characteristic whoosh of doors trying to open. But when I would look toward the entrance, I would see nothing that could trigger the motion sensors. At first, I assumed it was a malfunction with the door mechanism. Automatic systems sometimes develop sensitivity issues, responding to wind, passing vehicles, or small animals. I contacted our maintenance service to inspect the sensors and adjust their calibration. The system is functioning normally, the technician reported after a thorough examination. No mechanical issues, proper sensitivity settings, clean sensors. If the doors are activating, something is definitely triggering them. But the late-night activation continued, always following the same pattern. The doors would attempt to open repeatedly for several minutes, then stop until the following night. The timing was consistent, always beginning around 12:15 a.m., shortly after we completed closing procedures and locked the store. 3 weeks into this pattern, I started staying late to observe what was actually happening during these incidents. I would position myself in the store after closing, watching the entrance area through our security monitors and observing directly through the windows. At exactly 12:15 a.m., the automatic doors would begin their activation cycle. The sensors would detect movement. The doors would slide open to reveal empty space, remain open for the standard interval, then close again. This cycle would repeat 8 to 10 times over approximately 5 minutes. But the security cameras showed nothing. The entrance area appeared completely empty during these activations, with no visible movement that could explain the door sensor's behavior. No people, no animals, no debris blown by wind, nothing that should trigger the automatic opening mechanism. More disturbing was the sound that accompanied these activations. Beyond the mechanical noise of the doors themselves, I began hearing what sounded like someone pressing against the glass, tapping on the entrance frame, and making the kinds of movements associated with someone trying to enter a building. After a month of nightly disturbances, I contacted the building owner, Yamamoto-san, to ask whether there had been any recent incidents around our store that might explain the strange activity. His reaction was immediate and troubled. "You're experiencing disturbances around the entrance?" he asked carefully. "Have you noticed anything else unusual? Temperature changes, unexplained sounds, feelings of being watched?" When I described the automatic door activations and the sounds of someone trying to enter, Yamamoto-san's expression grew grave. He explained that 4 months ago, before I'd noticed the disturbances, there had been a tragic incident involving our store's exterior. "A homeless man died during that cold spell in February," he said quietly. "He was found against the wall beside your entrance, apparently seeking shelter from the wind and rain. The police determined he died of exposure sometime during the night." The man, identified as Tanaka-san, had been known to local shop owners as someone who occasionally asked for spare change or leftover food, but was generally harmless and polite. Several businesses in the area had provided him with small kindnesses, hot coffee, expired bento boxes, permission to rest in covered areas during severe weather. "He'd tried to enter your store that night," Yamamoto-san continued. "The police found evidence that he'd been pressing against the entrance doors, probably hoping to trigger the automatic opening mechanism and gain access to warmth and shelter. But our store's policy against loitering meant the doors were programmed to deactivate after closing hours. Tanaka-san had died outside, unable to access the warmth and safety that lay just beyond the glass entrance. That information transformed my understanding of the nightly disturbances. The automatic door activations weren't random malfunctions, they were Tanaka-san, still trying to enter the store that had denied him shelter during his final hours. The next night, when the 12:15 a.m. activations began, I found myself watching with new awareness. The doors would slide open as if someone were approaching, remain open as if someone were hesitating at the threshold, then close again when no entry occurred. The pattern suggested someone repeatedly attempting to enter, but being unable to cross into the store. Over the following weeks, the nightly attempts became more persistent. The door activations increased in frequency, and the sounds of someone pressing against the glass grew more urgent. It was as if Tanaka-san's desperation was intensifying, his need for shelter becoming more acute even though death had theoretically ended his physical vulnerability to cold and exposure. Most disturbing was my growing awareness of his presence during the attempts. While the security cameras showed nothing, I began sensing someone standing just outside the entrance, a figure positioned exactly where Tanaka-san would have been during his final night, pressing against the glass and hoping for the doors to grant him access. 4 weeks ago, I decided to address the situation directly. When the nightly door activations began, I approached the entrance and spoke toward the area where I sensed his presence. "Tanaka-san," I said quietly, "I know you're trying to come inside. I know you need warmth and shelter, but the store is closed now. You don't need to keep trying the doors." The door activations stopped immediately. For 3 nights, we had complete quiet during the post-closing period. I thought my acknowledgement had somehow resolved the situation. But then the attempts resumed, with increased intensity. The doors would activate continuously for longer periods, and I could hear what sounded like someone desperately pushing against the glass, growing increasingly frustrated that the barriers wouldn't yield. I contacted a Buddhist monk, Sato-san, who specializes in assisting spirits who died in distress and have become attached to specific locations. After visiting our store and observing the nightly phenomena, he confirmed what I'd begun to understand. Tanaka-san died seeking basic human necessities: warmth, shelter, safety. Sato-san explained. His spirit continues trying to fulfill those needs, but he's trapped in the desperation of his final moments when those necessities were denied. He pointed out that convenience stores like ours represent everything that was unavailable to Tanaka-san during life: 24-hour access, warmth, food, safety, and acceptance. Our automatic doors had become symbols of barriers, that kept him from the basic human needs that society had failed to provide. His attempts to enter aren't malevolent, Sato-san observed. They're the continuation of survival instincts that death hasn't extinguished. He's still seeking the shelter that would have saved his life. Sato-san performed purification rituals around our store's entrance, focusing on the area where Tanaka-san had died and the threshold he'd been trying to cross. He also placed protective omamori at key locations and taught me practices to acknowledge Tanaka-san's presence while maintaining appropriate boundaries. I cannot eliminate his need for shelter, Sato-san cautioned. That need is too fundamental to survival, and his death from exposure too traumatic. But I can help him understand that the shelter he seeks is no longer necessary for his well-being. The spiritual intervention changed the nature of the disturbances, but didn't eliminate them entirely. The nightly door activations became less frequent and less urgent. When they do occur, they seem more resigned than desperate, as if Tanaka-san continues his attempts out of habit rather than acute need. I've learned to accept these evening encounters as part of my closing routine. When I hear the familiar sound of someone trying to activate our entrance doors, I offer a quiet acknowledgement toward the area where Tanaka-san continues his vigil. The store is closed now, I say gently, but you're welcome to rest outside if you need to. You don't have to keep trying to get inside. Sometimes this acknowledgement seems to provide comfort, and the activation attempts will cease for the remainder of the night. Other times, the efforts continue with patient persistence, as if Tanaka-san is maintaining hope that eventually the doors will grant him access to the warmth and safety he never found during life. The most haunting aspect isn't the supernatural activity itself. It's recognizing how thoroughly the need for basic shelter can become someone's defining obsession. Tanaka-san's death occurred not from violence or illness, but from society's inability to provide the fundamental human requirements of warmth and protection. Our store, with its bright lights, constant warmth, and abundant food, represents everything that was denied to him during his final hours. The automatic doors that welcome paying customers had become insurmountable barriers when approached by someone whose only currency was desperate need. Late at night, when the store is quiet and I'm completing inventory tasks, I sometimes think about the thin line between inclusion and exclusion that convenience stores like ours maintain. We serve everyone during business hours, but after closing, the same doors that welcomed customers become barriers that exclude anyone seeking shelter or basic human necessities. The nightly attempts to activate our entrance doors serve as a reminder that some needs transcend normal business hours and corporate policies. Tanaka-san continues seeking admission to a space that represents survival itself, warmth when the world is cold, safety when the streets are dangerous, acceptance when society has turned away. His eternal vigil outside our doors forces me to confront uncomfortable questions about the boundaries we draw between public service and private business, between helping those who can pay and excluding those who cannot. Every night, as I lock up our store filled with abundant food and maintained at comfortable temperatures, I'm reminded of how much we take for granted and how little separates any of us from desperate need. And in the quiet moments after closing, when I hear the familiar sounds of someone trying to enter our warm, safe space, I understand that some hungers and some cold never truly end, even when death has theoretically resolved all earthly needs. Tanaka-san's continued presence reminds me that the human desire for basic dignity, warmth, and acceptance can persist beyond every limitation, including the ultimate barrier between life and death. The automatic doors that once represented progress and convenience have become a symbol of all the thresholds that remain permanently closed to those who need them most. And somewhere in that recognition lies both the horror and the profound sadness of a system that can provide abundance to some while leaving others to die just outside the doors of plenty. the Apprentice Seamstress. My name is Midori, and I'm a third-year fashion design student at Bunka Fashion College. Like many students pursuing creative careers in Tokyo, I work from a small apartment that doubles as my design studio, struggling to balance academic requirements with the practical need to build a portfolio and develop professional skills on a limited budget. My apartment in Shibuya Ward is tiny but functional. A single room that houses my bed, kitchenette, and most importantly, my workspace with a professional-grade sewing machine, cutting table, and storage for fabrics and supplies. The rent is manageable for a student, and the location near Fashion District suppliers makes it practical for sourcing materials and attending industry events. The building itself is older, constructed in the 1970s, with the kind of solid but aging infrastructure common to that era. Most residents are young professionals or students like myself, people who prioritize location and affordability over modern amenities. The thick walls and concrete construction provide good sound insulation, important when I need to work late into the night on project deadlines. For my first 2 years living here, everything functioned exactly as needed. I established productive routines around my academic schedule, taking advantage of the apartment's natural light during the day and using evening hours for detailed handwork that didn't require my sewing machine. The setup allowed me to pursue my studies seriously while managing living expenses independently. Then I began noticing unusual activity during the early morning hours. It started 3 months ago, during an intensive period when I was working on my senior collection. I would go to sleep around midnight after a full day of classes and evening design work, only to be awakened around 4 a.m. by the sound of my sewing machine running. At first, I assumed I'd forgotten to turn off the machine properly, or that there was an electrical issue causing it to activate randomly. But when I checked the machine, I would find it properly shut down, with no signs of recent use. The sounds were unmistakable, the distinctive rhythm of fabric being fed through the machine, the specific motor pattern of someone working at a steady, experienced pace. Not the hesitant stop-and-start rhythm of a student learning new techniques, but the confident, continuous operation of someone with decades of experience. After a week of early morning disturbances, I began staying awake to observe what was actually happening. At approximately 4 a.m., I would hear the sewing machine activate and run for exactly 2 hours, stopping precisely at 6 a.m., as if someone had completed their scheduled shift. But the machine itself remained motionless. The electrical power was off, the presser foot was up, and no fabric was positioned for sewing. Yet the sounds continued with perfect clarity, the motor running, the needle punching through fabric, the subtle variations in speed that indicate someone adjusting their pace for different types of seams. More mysterious was what I began finding in the morning. Fabric pieces that I'd cut but hadn't yet sewn would be found perfectly assembled with professional quality seams. Garments I'd been struggling with would be completed with techniques beyond my current skill level. Pattern pieces would be arranged with the precision that comes from years of production experience. The work was always impeccable. Seams were straight and properly finished, pattern matching was exact, and construction techniques were flawless. Whoever was doing this work possessed skills that represented decades of professional garment construction. But I was the only person with access to my apartment and supplies. 3 weeks into this phenomenon, I contacted my landlord, Yamada-san, to ask about the building's history and whether there might be any electrical issues that could explain the strange sounds. His reaction was immediate and troubled. "You're hearing sewing machines at night?" he asked carefully. "Are you working in the textile field?" When I explained that I was a fashion student and described the early morning disturbances, Yamada-san's expression grew thoughtful. He invited me to his office to discuss the building's background. "This building has an unusual history," he began. "Before it was converted to apartments in the 1970s, it operated as a garment factory for nearly 30 years. The entire structure was dedicated to textile production. He explained that the factory had employed mostly women, many of whom worked demanding schedules to meet production quotas for major clothing manufacturers. The work was piece rate, meaning income depended on volume and speed, creating intense pressure for productivity and precision. My apartment was part of the main production floor, Yamada-san continued. Row after row of industrial sewing machines, women working double shifts to support their families during the post-war recovery period. The factory had closed in the early 1970s when production moved to cheaper overseas locations. During the final months of operation, several workers had died from overwork and exhaustion, including one woman who collapsed at her machine during a night shift and was found the following morning. Ishikawa-san had worked here for 28 years, Yamada-san said quietly. She knew every aspect of garment construction, could operate any machine, could complete complex patterns faster than workers half her age. The factory was her entire life. She had died of a heart attack while working alone during the 4 to 6 a.m. shift, apparently trying to complete an urgent order before the day shift arrived. She was found slumped over her sewing machine, with a partially completed garment still positioned under the needle. We converted the building to apartments shortly after the factory closed, Yamada-san explained. But over the years, several tenants have reported unusual activity, always people working in fashion or textile-related fields. That conversation transformed my understanding of the early morning disturbances. The sounds weren't electrical malfunctions, they were Ishikawa-san, still reporting for her 4 to 6 a.m. shift, still trying to meet production quotas that had been impossible to fulfill during life. The next morning, when the 4 a.m. sewing sounds began, I positioned myself where I could observe my workspace carefully. While my machine remained inactive, I could sense movement in the area and the subtle shift of air that suggests someone working efficiently through familiar tasks. More remarkably, I began to feel my own hands wanting to move in rhythm with the invisible work being performed. My fingers would twitch as if holding fabric. My shoulders would position themselves as if leaning over a machine, and my breathing would synchronize with the pace of the phantom sewing. Over the following weeks, this physical synchronization intensified. During the early morning sessions, I would find myself unconsciously mimicking the movements of someone with decades of professional experience. My hands would move with precision I didn't know I possessed, and my understanding of garment construction would seem to expand beyond what I'd learned in school. When I worked on my own projects after these sessions, I noticed significant improvement in my technique. Seams that had previously challenged me became natural and easy. Pattern pieces that had confused me made perfect sense. My hands seemed to remember techniques I'd never formally learned. I contacted a Buddhist monk, Kawamoto-san, who specializes in work-related spiritual attachments and ancestral skill transmission. After visiting my apartment and observing one of the early morning sessions, he confirmed what I'd begun to understand. Ishikawa-san's muscle memory and professional knowledge have become spiritually embedded in this workspace. He explained, her decades of experience are being transmitted to current practitioners who work in the same location. He pointed out that traditional Japanese crafts often involve master-apprentice relationships, where knowledge is passed through direct observation and physical practice. Ishikawa-san's spiritual presence was continuing this transmission process, teaching through example and unconscious muscle memory transfer. She died while working, Kawamoto-san observed. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her skill and productivity. Death didn't release her from the obligation to share that knowledge with the next generation of garment workers. He performed purification rituals throughout my apartment, focusing on the area where industrial sewing machines had once operated. He also placed protective omamori at strategic locations and taught me practices to maintain respectful boundaries around the skill transmission process. I cannot eliminate her desire to teach and work, he cautioned. Her knowledge is too valuable, and her dedication to craftsmanship too strong. But I can help ensure that the learning process doesn't become overwhelming or interfere with your own creative development. The spiritual intervention helped establish healthier boundaries around the phenomenon. The early morning sewing sessions continue, but they no longer wake me or create anxiety. Instead, I've learned to appreciate them as advanced instruction from a master craftsperson whose knowledge would otherwise have been lost. I still find my projects completed or improved after the 4 to 6 a.m. sessions, but now I understand this as mentorship rather than mysterious interference. Ishikawa-san continues her work because teaching the next generation of seamstresses was always part of her responsibility as a skilled worker. My academic performance has improved dramatically since accepting this unconventional apprenticeship. Professors comment on the sophistication of my construction techniques and the professional quality of my finished garments. I've developed skills that typically take years of industry experience to master. Sometimes, during my own evening work sessions, I sense Ishikawa-san observing my progress, not interfering, but available for guidance when I encounter particularly challenging techniques. Her presence feels less like haunting and more like having access to a master craftsperson whose knowledge spans decades of professional garment construction. The most remarkable aspect isn't the supernatural activity itself. It's recognizing how thoroughly skilled work can become someone's defining identity. Ishikawa-san's knowledge and technique were so fundamental to who she was that death couldn't interrupt her commitment to excellence and teaching. Her continued presence in my workspace serves as both inspiration and reminder that true craftsmanship creates relationships that transcend normal learning boundaries. The skills she developed through decades of dedicated practice continue to be shared because knowledge, once mastered, seeks expression through the next generation of practitioners. Late at night, when I'm struggling with a particularly complex pattern or challenging technique, I sometimes whisper a quiet request toward the area where her machine once operated. Ishikawa-san, could you help me understand this construction method? And invariably, my hands seem to remember movements I've never formally learned, guided by muscle memory that belongs to someone who spent 28 years perfecting her craft. The early morning sessions have become a cherished part of my education, a master class with someone whose expertise represents the highest standards of professional garment construction. Through her continued work, I'm learning not just technique, but the dedication, precision, and respect for craftsmanship that defined her entire adult life. And in the quiet pre-dawn hours, when the sound of invisible sewing fills my apartment with the rhythm of skilled work being performed with love and precision, I understand that some forms of knowledge are too valuable to be lost, even when their original practitioners can no longer physically demonstrate their expertise. Ishikawa-san's eternal shift continues because the transmission of master-level skills was never just a job. It was her way of ensuring that the knowledge and dedication she'd spent a lifetime developing would continue to serve the next generation of seamstresses, connecting past and present through the timeless language of perfectly executed craftsmanship. The final inspection. My name is Watanabe, and I've been working as a real estate agent in Shibuya Ward for 15 years. It's competitive work that requires managing client expectations, market knowledge, and the delicate balance between honesty about property conditions and successful sales. In Tokyo's challenging rental market, every apartment has its story, and some stories are more difficult to navigate than others. Apartment 5G in the Sakura Residence building has been the most challenging property in my portfolio for the past 8 months. On paper, it should be highly desirable, a one-bedroom unit with excellent natural light, modern appliances, and prime location near multiple train stations. The rent is competitive, The building is well maintained, and the layout is ideal for young professionals or students. But apartment 5G has remained vacant despite dozens of viewings and several near signings. Potential tenants consistently express initial enthusiasm, followed by unexplained reluctance to commit. They cite vague concerns about atmosphere or feeling unsettled, but struggle to articulate specific problems with the property. The apartment's previous tenant, Nakamura-san, had lived there for 6 years until his death from Karoshi overwork syndrome last spring. He'd been a dedicated office worker at a major corporation, known for his meticulous attention to detail and compulsive need for perfection in both his professional and personal life. According to the building manager, Nakamura-san had maintained his apartment in pristine condition, with every item organized according to detailed systems and cleaning schedules that he documented in notebooks found after his death. His dedication to order and cleanliness had been so extreme that neighbors rarely heard any sounds from his unit. No television, no music, just the quiet efficiency of someone maintaining perfect domestic control. He died at his desk on a Sunday evening, apparently working on quarterly reports that weren't due for another month. The coroner determined he'd suffered a heart attack after working for nearly 18 hours straight, part of a pattern of excessive overtime that had characterized his final months. When I first took over apartment 5G's listing, I assumed the difficulty in renting was simply bad timing or minor issues that could be resolved with proper marketing. The unit showed well, photographs beautifully, and offered excellent value for the location. But after 3 months of failed rental attempts, I began noticing unusual phenomena during property viewings. Every time I arrived to show the apartment, I would find small improvements that I hadn't made. Pictures that had been slightly crooked would be perfectly straight. Floors that had accumulated light dust would be spotless. Shoes left casually at the entrance would be arranged in precise parallel lines. Initially, I assumed the building's cleaning service was being exceptionally thorough, though their contract only covered common areas. When I asked the building manager about extra cleaning in apartment 5G, he seemed confused. No additional services, he confirmed. The unit is cleaned once after a tenant moves out. Then it's the responsibility of the listing agent to maintain it for showings. But the mysterious maintenance continued. Before each viewing, I would find the apartment in better condition than I'd left it. Not just clean, but organized, with an attention to detail that exceeded professional cleaning standards. Books on the shelves would be arranged by height and subject. Kitchen items would be organized with mathematical precision. Even the position of furniture would be subtly adjusted to optimize traffic flow and visual appeal. More puzzling was the timing. These improvements would occur between my visits, but building security showed no record of anyone entering the unit. The electronic lock system tracked every entry, and only I had access codes for showing appointments. After 6 weeks of these mysterious improvements, I decided to investigate more systematically. I deliberately introduced small disorder before leaving the apartment, moved a chair slightly off-center, left a book open on the table, positioned shoes casually rather than precisely. When I returned the following day, everything had been corrected. The chair was repositioned for optimal visual balance, the book was closed and returned to its proper place on the shelf, and the shoes were arranged with the precise alignment that characterized Nakamura-san's organizational style. I contacted the building manager to discuss apartment 5G's history and ask about any unusual incidents since Nakamura-san's death. His reaction was immediate and troubled. "You're noticing organizational activity?" he asked carefully. "Things being arranged or cleaned without explanation?" When I described the mysterious improvements, his expression grew grave. He explained that the building staff had observed similar phenomena throughout the months since Nakamura-san's death. "Cleaning supplies go missing from storage closets," he said quietly. "Residents report hearing vacuum cleaners running in the empty apartment during early morning hours. The security guards have mentioned seeing lights in 5G when no one should be there. He revealed that apartment 5G had been officially classified as a Jikobuken property due to Nakamura-san's unnatural death from overwork. While not as stigmatized as suicide or violence, karoshi deaths still required disclosure and often created rental challenges. But the organizational activity, he continued, that's specific to Nakamura-san's personality. He was obsessed with perfection, with having everything exactly right. His death didn't release him from those compulsions. That conversation transformed my understanding of the ongoing improvements in apartment 5G. The mysterious maintenance wasn't random, it was Nakamura-san, still trying to achieve the perfect living environment that had consumed his life. The next time I arrived for a viewing, I paid closer attention to the specific improvements. Every change reflected the meticulous organizational systems that Nakamura-san had documented in his notebooks. Items were positioned according to his detailed diagrams, cleaned using his precise methods, and arranged with the mathematical precision that had characterized his approach to domestic management. But the apartment felt different during these viewings. Potential tenants would enter enthusiastically, then gradually become uncomfortable as they toured the space. They would comment on feeling watched or judged, as if someone were evaluating their worthiness to occupy the perfectly maintained environment. Several viewers mentioned feeling pressure to be extremely careful with their movements, removing shoes with unusual precision and avoiding touching surfaces unnecessarily. One young professional left abruptly, explaining that the apartment made her feel like she was being tested for cleanliness standards she could never meet. I began to understand why apartment 5G remained vacant, despite its obvious appeal. Nakamura-san's continued presence created an atmosphere of constant evaluation and impossible standards. His obsessive need for perfection was being projected onto potential tenants, making them feel inadequate before they'd even moved in. 3 weeks ago, I contacted a Buddhist monk, Matsuda-san, who specializes in work-related spiritual disturbances and obsessive-compulsive attachments. After visiting apartment 5G and observing the organizational phenomena, he confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Nakamura-san's need for control and perfection was so strong that death didn't release him from those obligations. Matsuda-san explained, he's still trying to create the perfect living environment, but his standards are impossible for living people to maintain. He pointed out that Nakamura-san's death from overwork represented the ultimate failure of his perfectionist systems. He died trying to achieve standards that were literally unsustainable. Now his spirit was trapped in an endless cycle of preparation and improvement, seeking the perfect state that had always eluded him during life. He's preparing the apartment for an ideal tenant who meets his impossibly high standards. Matsuda-san observed, but such a person doesn't exist, so he continues his preparations eternally. Matsuda-san performed purification rituals throughout apartment 5G, focusing on the areas where Nakamura-san had spent the most time organizing and cleaning. He also placed protective omamori at strategic locations and taught me practices to acknowledge Nakamura-san's presence while establishing realistic boundaries. I cannot eliminate his need for perfection, Matsuda-san cautioned. That drive is too fundamental to his identity. But I can help him understand that his preparation work has been successful, and that the apartment is ready for occupancy by normal, imperfect human beings. The spiritual intervention helped somewhat. The obsessive reorganization became less frequent, and the atmosphere during viewings became more welcoming. But Nakamura-san's presence hasn't disappeared entirely. I still find occasional improvements between visits, books, carefully aligned, surfaces polished to perfect cleanliness, small adjustments that reflect ongoing attention to detail, but these changes now feel more like helpful maintenance rather than compulsive preparation for impossible standards. More importantly, potential tenants no longer seem to feel the oppressive sense of being evaluated. The apartment retains its careful organization, but has regained the possibility of being lived in by real people with normal levels of cleanliness and order. Last month, I finally succeeded in renting apartment 5G to a young accountant who appreciated the meticulous condition and seemed comfortable with the unit's unusual energy. She mentioned feeling like the apartment wanted to be cared for properly and committed to maintaining the organizational systems that were already in place. During the move-in process, I noticed that Nakamura, San's helpful presence, seemed pleased with the new tenant's respectful approach to the space. The mysterious improvements continued, but became more supportive than corrective, assisting with organization, rather than imposing impossible standards. The new tenant has been living in apartment 5G for 6 weeks now, and the arrangement seems to work well for everyone involved. She maintains the apartment according to high standards but within humanly achievable limits, while Nakamura-san provides the kind of detailed maintenance support that reflects his expertise in domestic organization. It's like having a very helpful but invisible roommate, she told me recently. Someone who really cares about keeping everything perfect, but doesn't judge me when I'm not perfect myself. I continue managing other properties in the building, and apartment 5G no longer represents the challenge it once did. But I've gained new appreciation for how thoroughly work-related stress and perfectionist tendencies can become someone's defining characteristics. The most haunting aspect isn't the supernatural activity itself. It's recognizing how easily the pursuit of perfection can become a trap that persists beyond normal life boundaries. Nakamura. San's death from overwork represented the ultimate failure of systems designed to create perfect control. Yet his need for that perfection continued even after the pressures that created it had ended. His eternal preparation routine serves as a reminder that some forms of professional obsession become so fundamental to identity that they transcend every limitation, including death itself. The apartment he worked so hard to perfect continues to benefit from his attention, but now within boundaries that allow for human imperfection and normal living patterns. And in the quiet efficiency of apartment 5G's ongoing maintenance, I'm reminded that dedication to excellence, when properly channeled, can create environments that truly serve the people who inhabit them, even when that dedication originates from beyond the normal realm of property management.